secondly, Lenin talks about the communist movement as an international movement and the need to study from revolutionary theory arising in other countries. That's something that we hold fast to today. And of course, unfortunately, in Canada, we have not had the privilege of having a socialist revolution. So we need to look at other countries that have actually gotten closer to socialism or achieved socialism and have tried to build it. So that's something we take pretty seriously in the Communist Party as an internationalist movement. And also Lenin talks about, I'll read a quote: "The role of the vanguard fighter can be fulfilled only by a party that is guided by the most advanced theory." He talks about, specifically when he's talking about this, he's talking about past Russian revolutionary writers and building on their kind of formulations and theory that they've come up with. And I think in Canada, we have this rich 100-year history of the Communist Party that we're celebrating this year. And we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We need to take a look at our history that we're proud of and apply the lessons that we've learned to the current situation of today. We're not, it's important not to get stuck in dogma of the past, but it's important not to think that we need to reinvent everything either. So I think this is some of the key reasons why we're gathered here today. And I should say the point is kind of to formulate a common understanding of everybody that's coming into the party or are in the party in order for us to be able to work together on a practical basis. We're not just studying theory for its own sake, but because we want to apply it in the struggles and we want to link the party to mass labor and people's and democratic struggles, and to be to actually win the role of the vanguard in Canada. So with this in mind, we hope that people will be able to take what they learn in the school and feel more comfortable joining new clubs and feel like you have a basis, more of an understanding of like why we do things in a certain way or our outlook on the world. I think, well, the goal is that you would be able to play a role more quickly with this basis in the things you learn in the school. So with this in mind, I do want to urge patience. I know we'll see how things go today with over 150 people in on the meeting. I imagine maybe Jay will say a couple more logistical things, but please try and keep yourself muted. There's going to be limited time for answering everybody's questions probably, but at the same time, while I'm urging patience, I want you to encourage any feedback that you may have. I think we have planned some discussion in the last day of the school, which will include some reflection on how the school went. So it would be even helpful, honestly, to us as organizers if you wrote down any observations you had during the school, what was going well, what wasn't going well, what you really thought was valuable during the sessions, what maybe is not what you don't really see as immediately useful. Any kind of thoughts that you have during the school, if you could just maybe write them down and be ready on that last day to contribute to that discussion, that would be very helpful, because at the rate we're growing, I think this will likely only be the first of many online new member schools. So you are a guinea pig, sorry. Anyways, I just want to say I look forward to meeting many of you. I've already met many of you over the last year, but meeting the ones that I haven't met, maybe that'll take a while for comrades that are outside of Ontario, but hope to see you at our next central convention, which is only a year and a bit away, which is scary. But anyways, welcome to the party, and I'll hand it back over to Jay.
Thank you, Drew. So sorry, I'm out of view of the camera right now. I was going to do just a bit of a land acknowledgement as well, although we're basically all across many different traditional territories as well. So I'll try to wing it. So we're meeting today from all parts of the country, but wherever we are located, we are on the lands of the Indigenous people who were the first peoples here in the northern half of Turtle Island. In every part of the land called Canada, these territories were taken by colonialists and then by the Canadian capitalist state for the profits of big corporations which exploit all working people. This is true where unfair treaties were signed under duress and usually later ignored or violated against the interests of Indigenous nations, and continually so. This is equally true in regions where these nations have never signed treaties or surrendered their traditional and ancestral territories, which remain the unceded homelands of Indigenous peoples. Wherever we work and live in this country, we always give our thanks and respect to the original owners whose lands we are in. As communists, we demand the right of all Indigenous people across the world to the self-determinations of their nations and national sovereignty. So thank you very much. As Joe was mentioning, there'll be a kind of a limited time for discussion. However, if you have any questions at all, please put them in the chat. If you don't know where the chat is, there should be a little bar on the bottom that you can click on that will say chat, basically. You can put it there, and I'll collect them and deliver them to the presenters at the discussion time afterwards. So we'll have a little bit of back and forth. Anyways, I'll get in front of the camera then. Just to say, I'm going to hand it over now to Mr. Miguel Figueroa. So thank you very much.
Don't call me Mr. Jay. Good afternoon or good morning, comrades. Thanks, Jay and Drew, for hosting this this school and this first session of the school. Let me just first of all bring up my screen sharing.
And also, if you don't mind, put your camera a little bit lower so that.
You want me to move the camera? Like that?
You're okay, Miguel. You're good.
Oh. All right. Can everybody see the screen share?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. There we go. Okay, so welcome, comrades, to this session, which is an introduction to political economy. Just before getting into it, just a few introductory remarks. First of all, there's quite a bit of material to go through in this session. And as a result of that, I'm going to be going through it fairly quickly to provide, hopefully, some time for questions, comments, and so on in the second half of this session. With respect to the readings, some of you may not have received the readings, or if you have, you might not have had a chance to read them yet before today. So I would encourage everybody, when you have a chance, to actually do those readings. They're not long, because about 13 or 14 pages in total, from Karl Marx's speech, in fact, to a session of the International Workingmen's Association, which of course was the first international way back in 1848, where he discusses some of the key elements of political economy. Of course, and it was incorporated into a pamphlet called Value, Price, and Profit, which of course is the entire text of his presentation. And you can get that online as well. So what was sent to you was actually a few sections of his larger presentation. Please also bear in mind that I'm not going to be watching the chat section during the presentation. It doesn't mean, of course, you can't use the chat section, but just bear in mind that I won't be monitoring it. So any questions or points that you raise there will need to be dealt with when we get around to the second half of the presentation. And I think Jay is going to be monitoring that and grouping those questions or those points which have a commonality so that they can be dealt with at one go, so to speak. Fair enough. That's it. I see most people have muted their microphones, so please please keep those muted if you can. Now, moving on. This is called An Introduction to Political Economy. And so I guess the starting point is, what the hell does political economy mean? And I don't raise this in a flippant or a sarcastic way, because there are many, many people on the left in the progressive movement, in the labor movement, and even those who have joined the Communist Party or joined the YCL, who have joined because they see that capitalism is a dysfunctional system. It's a system in decay. It's an unfair system. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. And they sense the injustice of the system of capitalism and are striving for an alternative, and that alternative being socialism, of course, socialism and ultimately communism. But they've never heard the expression political economy, and there's a reason for that. Because we've all been raised, for the most part, in any case, in the educational system in Canada or other capitalist countries. And the bourgeois educational system, virtually everywhere, has erected, if you will, a kind of a Chinese wall, if you'll excuse the expression, between politics and political science on one hand and economics on the other. And that's not by accident. It's in the interest of the ruling class to separate these two. So the economy, that has to do with markets and microeconomics and the decisions of individual companies and corporations, deals with labor law and so on and so forth. But it is disarticulated from politics, which is something else that happens in legislatures and parliaments and what have you. But of course, as Marxists, we understand that these two questions are intimately connected. So you have the economic base and then the political superstructure, the state and other institutions associated with the superstructure, which are dialectically connected and spring basically from the basic relations of production, the class relations, the social relations in any given society, and how these are moderated or controlled through the political superstructure, the state, the prison system, the criminal codes, the army, the police, and so on. So why is political economy important? Well, it is a decisive aspect of Marxism. As a matter of fact, Lenin, many years ago, wrote a pamphlet which was called The Three Component Parts, or the Three Sources and the Three Component Parts of Marxism. And in terms of the component parts, he identified political economy, dialectical and historical materialism, and the strategy and tactics of the working class struggle. Political economy, obviously, we're going to get into. Dialectical and historical materialism is the next class, which deals with basic Marxist philosophy. And then, of course, the strategy and tactics of struggle, which is a concentration, an accumulation, concentration of the world historic efforts of workers and oppressed peoples to struggle against the capitalist order and to create a new society. So in a sense, you could say, well, political economy is theory, historical and dialectical materialism is theory, and strategy and tactics is a kind of a composite of practice. But in fact, I think that's the wrong way of looking at it. All three are intimately connected with both theory and practice. But certainly political economy is considered to be one of the key component parts of Marxism. And that is because it gets at the essence, the underlying dynamics of the capitalist system, why it does what it does. It's not a question of, well, there's good capitalists and bad capitalists. It's not a question of morality, even though historically many were drawn to the ideas of socialism on that basis. If you go back to the earliest writings of people like Thomas More and others, Thomas More's famous treatise, Utopia, where he talked about a different type of society, a society based on cooperation, not on competition, a society which was liberatory in the sense that there wasn't any forms of social or class oppression and what have you. But the great discovery, and we'll get to this in a moment, of Marx was to get at what is it in the dynamics of capitalism that drives it in a particular direction. Why capitalists do what they do, why workers are driven to do what they do, and what is the kernel of the contradictions within capitalism. And that kernel, of course, is in the production process itself and the generation of surplus value. So we're going to get into all of those questions here, but I just wanted to set the stage of why political economy is so bloody decisive. You know, there are very progressive and militant even activists who take an anti-capitalist position, who fight for deep going reforms, not just petty reforms and so on. But nevertheless, they don't really understand how capitalism really essentially works and why the system is riddled with contradictions, which can only be solved through the overthrowing of capitalism and the creation of a new social order, new social relations in society. And so they're, you know, they could take excellent positions on Palestine or on indigenous rights or on social questions, healthcare, and the preservation of the social safety net, so-called, on various issues domestically and internationally. But essentially, they're still tied to accepting capitalism as the natural order and strive then to prettify it, to make it more caring, to make it a capitalism with a human face. And hence they're drawn to the struggle for immediate reforms, which, by the way, is not bad. I mean, you know, reforms are important, and communists fight for reforms as well. But we have a deeper understanding about why reforms in and of themselves are problematic for two reasons. First of all, because the capitalist class will only grant reforms or agree to reforms when they have to, and at the first opportunity, they will take back those reforms. They will try to roll back any of the gains that are fought within the confines of capitalism and the capitalist state. Secondly, even if they didn't do that, if they said, okay, well, so fair enough, we raise the minimum wage, we do this, we do that, we provide unemployment insurance, we can't touch that, and so on and so forth. Those reforms in and of themselves do not address the basic contradictions of capitalism. So as important as the struggle for reforms are, they are limited because of it. And that's why, of course, we are communists, because we see beyond the struggle for reforms and the struggle for reforms in its relationship to the struggle for revolution, for socialism. So with those introductory comments, I'm going to move into the PowerPoint. I know, you know, there's some people who don't like PowerPoint presentations. So apologies to those of you who feel that way. But it seemed like the easiest way for me to present this material. So that said, let's get right into it. So what is the subject matter of political economy? I talked a little bit about that. Marxist political economy is concerned with the social relations. Oh dear, how can I get rid of that? There, got rid of it. The social relations between people in the process of production. It studies the economic laws governing the production and distribution of material benefits in human society at various stages of its development. Material production is the basis of human existence. To sustain life, people have to produce food. They have to feed themselves and put food on the table, clothing, shelter, and other vital necessities. Of course, over time, those vital necessities become enlarged. You know, education, the struggle for social welfare, and so on, for pensions and what have you. But nevertheless, all of these are tied to the material production for the basis of human existence. The process of production consists of the interaction between society and nature. Regardless of its form, the interaction between society and nature consists of three elements: labor, the objects of labor, and the means of labor. So we're going to dive into that in a moment, but just to put that out there. So what is labor? You know, some of this may seem, you know, very obvious to everybody, but you will see how these building blocks are the basis for Marxist political economy. So labor is purposeful activity aimed at adapting natural objects to satisfy human wants and needs. Engels actually said that labor is the prime basic condition of all human existence. And this to such an extent that in a sense, we have to say that labor created humanity itself. So here's a question. What is labor? If I grab a fishing pole and I spend an hour down at the lake trying to catch something, is that labor? Well, yes and no. If you're fishing because you want to catch the dinner for yourself and your family, then obviously that's labor. Or if you're actually a gill netter or you're working on a trawler, catching fish and selling it to a fish processing company, that obviously is labor as well. But if I had to take my fishing pole and I'm just doing it to relax as a form of rest and recreation, because I enjoy fishing, and it's catch and release, I'm going to put the fish back into the lake afterwards and so on, well, then that wouldn't be considered labor. So to understand what labor is, it's not just activity itself, but it's purposeful activity to meet and satisfy human needs and wants. So what are the objects of labor? The objects of labor are things found in nature to which people apply their labor. The earth and its subsoil is a universal object of labor. Of course, we've come to understand that just because it's an object of labor, it doesn't mean that it can be recklessly treated with abandon to service the needs of one species, let's say. But nevertheless, the natural world is an object to which we apply labor. The range of objects of labor expands with the progress of science. New objects appear, such as synthetic materials, and so on. And here's a question: can people be objects of labor? Under what circumstances? Well, this is kind of an interesting thing, because usually we talk about people being the laborers, those who expend labor on the objects of labor. But under specific circumstances, even humans can become objects of labor. And what is one perhaps most obvious example is the marketing, the selling of organs, of body parts. In many parts of the world, there is a thriving trade in the sale of body parts. And in that sense, even human beings become objects of labor, which produces organs and other things that can be used transformed into commodities in the production process. So what are the means of labor? Well, the means of labor are the things that people use to act upon the objects of labor. We can't just use our bare hands. They can produce nothing by themselves, however, and must put in these means of labor have to be put into motion by people. So these are essentially, in the first place, the instruments of labor. Marx called the instruments of labor the bone and muscle of production. Everything from a stone axe and a bow and arrow to sophisticated machinery, computers, automated systems, AI, and so on. So what do Marxists mean when we speak of the productive forces in a society? So we have production, but what do we mean by productive forces? Well, the productive forces are the means of labor and the objects of labor taken together. This is what constitutes the means of production. So the workforce and the objects of labor and the instruments of labor, the machinery, the land, the factories, and so on, all of these together constitute the means of production. And the means of production and the people with their experience and skills together constitute the productive forces. So I misspoke there. Actually, so the means of production are the means of labor, the instruments of labor, the technology, and so on, and the objects of labor, natural resources. But together with the people who then employ those means of production constitute the productive forces in any given society. So what do Marxists mean when we speak of relations of production? Well, as communities or societies change nature through the process of labor, people invariably enter into social relations with one another, individually and collectively. Marxist political economy focuses on the collective relations, those involving large groups of people or whole classes of people in the process of production. So you can look at individual relations, but what's most important here is how people interact in a social sense. And here we get into, of course, the emergence of social classes. The Marxist Dictionary of Political Economy, which, by the way, is out of print, and I can't find it anywhere on the net, but it's a very valuable resource. I have a copy in my library. I think perhaps others have as well. Defines the relations of productions as the social relations among people evolving irrespective of their will or consciousness. That is, objectively, in the process of production, distribution, exchange, and consumption of material wealth. So this isn't something that, somebody thought up, this was a good idea, or this is how we should operate. It takes place objectively in terms of the relations between different sections of the population. And we're going to get into the various types of relations of production that'll make it clearer. Invariably, production relations are connected to property relations. Why is that? Well, depending on the nature of the society, there are different types of property relations, but those become essential in terms of differentiating one type of relations of production or mode of production in a broader sense compared to other types of property relations. But essentially, when you cut through it all, there are two basic types of property relations. What are they? Well, they're private property relations and social property relations. Social property relations could take the form of state ownership, municipal ownership and production, cooperative ownership, and so on. But these stand in contradistinction. They stand separately and apart from private property relations. And that, of course, raises the question, is there a third kind of production relations? Well, there have been many over the years, over the decades, over the centuries, in fact, who have tried to find a third type of property relations, and they have been unsuccessful. They've tried to fashion hybrid arrangements and so on. We'll get into that further down the road. But essentially, there is no third kind of property relations. It's either social property or private property. So what then is meant by the mode of production? Simply put, the mode of production is the dialectical unity of the productive forces on the one hand. That is to say, the objective assessment of the instruments of labor, the technology, and so on, the natural resources upon which those instruments of labor are applied, and of course, the working class, those who actually do the productive work. So those are the productive forces, and they are objective. And secondly, the production relations that prevail in any given society at any particular moment in time. These are not the same. And in fact, you will find out further as we get into particularly the question of historical materialism, that it's precisely when the productive forces get out of whack with the production relations. So the productive forces grow objectively over time as through science and technology and social knowledge, the productive forces grow. But the production relations may still be stuck in, let's say, slave owning societies or feudal societies and so on. And as the disconnect between the productive forces on the one hand and the production relations on the other grows and widens and becomes irreconcilable, that's when there is a qualitative leap from one type of mode of production to the next. It's important to note that different types of production relations can exist simultaneously in a given society, but it's the dominant, the prevailing type of social relations which determine the mode of production. So for instance, we can look in many countries where there are different types of, you could say, production relations. For instance, in many countries which are essentially capitalist, nevertheless, there could be feudal elements. There might even be slave owning elements. But what's important here is to say, what is the decisive type of production relations in any given society? What is determinant, if you will, in terms of the mode of production? So Marxism generally considers that there's 5 basic modes of production. What are they? Well, whoops, I jumped ahead here. I didn't list them, but I'll list them right now. Primitive communal society, where you had small tribes and clans of people, very small communities, and their capacity to produce new value, new wealth was very limited. So basically, they were in a kind of a survival mode. So part of the clan would go hunting. Often it would be the males in that society who would be the hunters and gatherers, if you will, and those who were primarily responsible for regenerating the tribe, of raising the families and what have you. And that's where you get into the first division of labor, and the arising of the patriarchy. But the patriarchy really didn't exist under primitive communal society. It only started to develop when there was the emergence of class divisions within society, where you had a slave-owning class on the one hand and slaves on the other, or aristocracy on one hand and feudal serfs on the other. And of course, within capitalism, the capitalist class and the working class. And of course, the 5th mode of production is socialism as the first stage of communism. So we could say the communist mode of production. So we have basic primitive communal society, then the emergence of class divisions, and first slave-owning society, then feudalism, then capitalism, and then socialism and communism, which in a very important sense reflects a return to primitive society, where there were no class divisions, but obviously at a higher level of society. So you could almost imagine a spiral moving from a non-exploitative society where everybody's struggling and sharing the wealth, sharing the food, and so on, then through class divisions, class divided society, and then returning in a way, in a sense, but obviously at a higher level, to much more of a sharing and equitable society in the form of socialism and communism. So what did Marx consider the most basic element in capitalist production relations, the starting point for unveiling the innermost workings of capitalism? Here we're going to start to focus particularly on the political economy of capitalism, as opposed to slave societies or feudalism, because it's most vital for us to understand the political economy of capitalism, because that's the dominant mode of mode of production that exists virtually everywhere around the world. Not entirely, but everywhere, most everywhere. Well, the starting point for understanding how capitalism functions starts with the commodity. As a matter of fact, if you read, or if you have read Karl Marx's famous works, Capital, The very first chapter of the very first volume of Capital starts with the commodity. And there's a reason why he starts talking about the commodity, and we're going to get right into that right now. So what is a commodity? Well, a commodity is a product of labor capable of satisfying a human need and produced primarily for exchange rather than for immediate consumption by the producer. So for instance, you could have a farm family that has a small plot of land. They might have a chicken coop. They might grow a few crops. They might even husband some livestock. And obviously they take some of those eggs and put on the kitchen table. So part of that production is for their immediate consumption, but essentially most of that production, particularly under conditions of capitalism, is for exchange. So what we're looking here is an understanding that a commodity is something that's produced primarily for exchange rather than immediate consumption. When did commodities make their first appearance in social relations? Well, this is kind of an interesting question because, if you go back in your history books, you read about the ancient Phoenicians plying their trade in the Mediterranean between various ports, Cairo, Turkey, in ancient Greece, and so on and so forth. There were commodities, and they exchanged those commodities. Commodities are not something particular or unique to capitalism. What's important here, of course, is that it's only under capitalism that virtually everything becomes commodified. Commodities as the products of labor began to be manufactured when the social division of labor appeared. With the presence of independent, isolated producers in a period of decay of the primitive communal system and the emergence of slave relations. But it was under capitalism that commodity production became universal and dominant. So commodities is a historical category. When we reach the level of fully communist society, not the first stage of socialism, but when after socialism has matured and when the conditions exist for a full communist society, the concept of commodities will no longer have any meaning. And certainly they didn't have any meaning in ancient primitive communal societies either. Its essence changes depending on the type of production relations dominant within a given society. So in the early millennia, you had simple commodity production. This is small craft production and so on, the raising of crops and so on. And this, of course, became much more variegated and complex at the level of capitalist commodity production. So hopefully that's clear about, what is a commodity. Now we're going to get into the question of the price and value of commodities, because we know that there's commodities and commodities, and they're not all of an equal price and all of an equal value. So let's look at this question more deeply. Every commodity has by definition a value, which in turn is expressed in a price so that it can be exchanged between buyer and seller. What's the difference between the price and value, or more precisely, the exchange value? We're going to get into this a bit more, but whenever we talk about value, it in fact has two sides to it, two aspects to value. There is the use value of something and the exchange value of something, and they're not synonymous. They are different. You know the old expression that one person's garbage is another person's great find, so if you have a garage sale, people will sell things that have no use value to them, but they have an exchange value because there's other people who can use that commodity and they're prepared to exchange something, money or barter or whatever. But it's important right off the bat to understand that what we're talking about here when we talk about value is the exchange value of something. and the price. So price is based on the exchange value of a commodity, but it's not identical to it. The price of something can oscillate either above or below its exchange value, depending on market conditions. And principally among them, of course, is supply and demand. So a given commodity, let's say a tablet, you want to go buy a tablet, it has a value, but the price may not be identical to the value. It could be more than the value, and that's because they're in short supply or there's high demand for it, and there's a kind of a disconnect between supply and demand. Or conversely, the price could come down when there's a glut of that commodity on the market and the demand softens for whatever reason and so on. But over time, the distance between price and the exchange value of a commodity tends to narrow. And this goes right back to Adam Smith, where he talked about the wealth of nations. He talked about the hidden hand of the market, so that if there is a glut of products in one hand and there's a shortage in another sector of the economy, then investment will flow from one sector to another to meet the different demands for different products and commodities and so on. There are, of course, other things that also distort a price, most principally of which is monopoly control. So when you have a handful of monopolies who collude, and they do it today as well as in the past, and they have anti-monopoly legislation, which is supposed to prevent that, rarely does it effectively. But the fact of the matter is that the degree of monopoly concentration of wealth in the productive sphere leads also to distortions between the price of something and its intrinsic exchange value. So now I think we're going to get into, so what is the exchange value? How do you determine what the exchange value of something is? How do you compare a tablet, for instance, to a 10-speed bike? Why is one more expensive or less expensive? Why one has a higher exchange value than the other? Now, this is just referring to price gouging, price fixing, and other monopoly practices that can distort and usually inflate market prices. Ultimately, however, the price is a reflection of the inherent value of a commodity. So what then is the basis for determining the value? Well, here we get into the labor theory of value. And this is not something which was discovered, if you will, by Marx and Engels. In fact, there were economists who predated Marx and Engels who first started to understand where value comes from, and essentially developed the concept or the theory of the labor theory of value. So the labor theory of value predates the seminal works of Marx and Engels. Reference to labor as the decisive determinant in value dates all the way back to Adam Smith. And he wrote that the real price of everything, what everything really costs to a man who wants to acquire it, is the toll and the trouble of acquiring it or producing it. What everything is really worth to a man who's acquired it and who wants to dispose of it in exchange and exchange it for something else is the toil and trouble which he can save for himself and impose upon other people. And he went further. He said that the word value, it is to be observed, has two different meanings. This is getting back to this point about use value and exchange value that I referred to earlier. And sometimes expresses the utility of some particular object, and sometimes the power of purchasing other objects, which the possession of that object conveys. One may be called the value in use, which we now use the expression use value, and the other value in exchange or exchange value. The things which have the greatest value in use have frequently little or no value in exchange, and on the contrary, Those which have the greatest value in exchange have frequently little or no value in use. Well, he's making a bit of a funny here, but he's trying to pull out the fact that these are two very distinct features or components of value. Use value on one hand and exchange value on the other. So now we get into abstract value. The exchange value of a commodity derives from the amount of labor expended in its production. It's so-called embedded labor. So this is the source of value when you're trying to determine, for instance, how much that 10-speed bike, what is the real value of that 10-speed bike, quite apart from the price and so on in the market at any given time, its intrinsic value. It springs from the amount of labor that is expended in producing that 10-speed bike, and so-called embedded labor. But how can we quantify the different types of concrete labor? Because building a bike is a lot different than assembling and producing a tablet, for instance. The different types of concrete labor employed in producing different commodities. Different kinds of labor differ as to their purpose, the kind of operations involved, the objects of the labor that they're working on, the instruments of labor that are used, and so on. But for all of the diversity of actual or concrete forms of labor, they have in common the expenditure of human labor power in general. That is to say, the abstract labor that has to be applied in order to produce a given commodity. On this basis, all commodities, whether it's a 10-speed bike or whether it's a bushel of wheat or I don't know, a space rocket, whatever, all of these things can be compared, even though the labor, the specific concrete labor is quite different in the production of these things. Nevertheless, they can be compared based on an understanding of the abstract labor, the masses of congealed abstract labor that differ only in quantity. Okay, so we know that different commodities have different values, and that value springs from the amount of labor that's embedded in it. But how do you quantify labor? How do we understand labor? And why is one person's, how do you compare one person's labor to some other person's labor? Well, here it's important to understand what is socially necessary labor time. It's time, in fact, which is the increment, which is the instrument for quantifying, if you will, the expenditure of labor. The amount of embedded abstract labor in a given commodity is measured by the labor time involved in its production. But this can vary, sometimes widely, from workshop to workshop, from factory to factory. But the value of two similar or separately produced commodities, assuming that they're of comparable quality and durability and so on, cannot have two different values in exchange. The market determines or assigns one common value to both commodities. So whether it's, let's use the example of a pair of shoes. You know, you have a small workshop in your garage and you have leather and soles and heels and so on, and you produce a pair of shoes and it takes you 3 days to do it. In a factory, that same pair of shoes can be produced in 15 minutes. But the value, you can't go into the market and say, well, my shoes took 3 days to produce, so obviously I have to charge more and you have to pay more for my pair of shoes. Well, if they're of comparable value to the one that comes from a factory and produced in 15 minutes, people will say, well, that's ridiculous. Why would I possibly spend my money on buying your pair of shoes when a similar or comparable product is right across the aisle and sold at a much lower price? So as the market determines the common value of commodities, this is regardless of how much labor time each of the individual producers have actually expended. So the value of a given commodity, therefore, is based on the average amount of labor time required for its manufacture under socially reasonable production conditions, level of efficiency, the intensity of labor, and so on, at a given moment in time. This is called the socially necessary labor time. But of course, we know that the socially necessary labor time changes, and it changes precisely because the amount of labor, the embedded labor to produce a hard drive, for instance, differs over time. I'll give you a quick example. When I was first in the Maritimes in the early 90s and late 80s, early 90s, and I was a correspondent for the party paper, computers came on the market, and I said, well, I need a computer so that I can file my stories quickly through a modem to the editorial offices in Toronto. And they said, fine, we'll send you a computer. And they sent this computer, and it had all sorts of different parts. I didn't understand how to use it, but eventually I figured it out. But it was very primitive. It didn't have any hard drive. It had 2 floppy drives, and you had to use these 5.5-inch floppy disks to put in and store data on these floppy disks, but no hard drive built into the computer itself. And then, of course, hard drives were developed. And I went to a computer shop in Halifax, and I said, I'd like to buy a hard drive and have it installed in my computer. And he said, yes, by all means, no problem. Leave it with me for a week and so on. And I asked him how much it would cost. And he said, it's $600. And I said, well, what is the storage capacity of this hard drive? And he said, it's 30 megabytes. 30 megabytes for $600. Now, was this computer shop ripping me off? No, because that's how much the value, the embedded labor of that hard drive was back then. Well, we know now, of course, you can go to some Office Depot or wherever and pick up a USB drive, which is essentially a small hard drive, which has 100 times the capacity of 30 megs. You know, I think we even have a terabyte size USB now, or close to it anyway. And you could buy it for $19.95. So $600 in 1990, and by the way, $600 was a hell of a lot more than it is today in $1990 versus 1995. So the value of commodities sometimes can go up, but often they actually go down. And that's why you see reductions in the prices of various electronics and so on and so forth. Because the amount of labor time that is necessary for the production of that commodity, that is to say, its value in exchange has declined. The value of a given commodity, therefore, is based on the average amount of time that's required for its manufacture, and that's the socially necessary labor time. I hope that makes sense to folks. So now we get into commodity exchange and the role of money. There are different types of commodities can now be exchanged on the market based on their respective embedded socially necessary labor time. So just as a crude example, 1 sheep equals 14 chickens. Why is that? Well, because the amount of labor that's necessary, of feed that's necessary to raise that sheep to the point that it can then be sold on the market far outweighs the similar cost to produce a chicken that can be sold. So 1 sheep could be equal to 14 chickens, and that's how different types of commodities can be exchanged in the market. As commodity exchange grew in magnitude and complexity, it became necessary to establish a universal equivalent, because not everybody wants to drag their sheep, and they might not want 14 chickens. So how does one person sell a sheep? Well, he might want to sell it for a horse, but the seller of the horse will say, well, I'm not going to give you 1 sheep for a horse, and I don't need 4 sheep. I only need 1 sheep. So how do those exchanges take place? Well, you need some sort of intermediary, some universal equivalent, and of course that's what money is. It corresponds to the value of different commodities based on their embedded labor. And money serves many purposes. I won't spend a lot of time on this. It's a measure of value, of course, like we just talked about. It's a medium for circulation, like paper money. It's a means of hoarding. So using either US dollars or gold or some other precious metal as a means of accumulating and hoarding value and wealth. It's also a means of payment. And of course, it serves as world money so that goods from different countries can be exchanged. So let's return to the question of the law of value. The law of value is an objective economic law governing commodity production. Social labor is expressed in the value of commodities exchanged in proportion to the quantity of their socially necessary labor time that's embedded in them. Those producers who expend less labor than is socially necessary will secure additional income. Those whose individual production costs are higher than the socially necessary suffer losses and go out of business unless they manage to reorganize their production in time. So it is in the vital interests of individual producers, therefore, to constantly strive to reduce the labor time that they expend per unit of commodity that they produce compared to other producers. And this is done in many different ways. First and foremost, by introducing more advanced labor-saving technologies, but also by refining production techniques. You have the Ford model of production. The assembly line was a qualitative increase. It wasn't necessarily based simply on new technology, but also on production methods and techniques. And of course, also by increasing the intensity of labor. So you may still have an assembly line, but if you speed up the assembly line and workers have to work harder and because the line is moving quicker and they have to keep up with the line, that's a way of essentially increase, not only obviously increase the intensity of labor, but also tends to reduce the value of any given commodity. So the law of value also regulates economic activity at a macro level, shifting resources, labor, investment from one industry or sector of the economy to another. And Adam Smith, I talked about this earlier, referred to the self-regulating role of the law of value as the hidden hand. So if all of these things were kind of understood, even by economists and philosophers, long before Karl Marx and Frederick Engels came on the scene, then what was the great discovery of Marx and Engels? Well, the great discovery was, first of all, a clear understanding that labor itself is a commodity. We're going to get into this a bit more, but labor itself has both a use value and an exchange value. And the exchange value is the wages that the boss pays you. So in other words, your labor power becomes a commodity. And part of that, of course, was also Marx's understanding of the dual character of labor. So we talked about use value and exchange value. But what's important here is that this also applies to labor power itself. So labor power has a use value in the sense that 8-hour shift in a factory, that worker will produce so much new value embedded in the commodities that come off the assembly line and go into the trucks and off to the malls and so on. But the exchange value of that labor is what the capitalist pays that worker in the form of wages, and they're not the same. And this gets at the nub of what we call exploitation under capitalism and why it's so central to the dynamics of capitalism, no matter how much you reform it, how much you prettify it, and so on. This is inherent to the capitalist mode of production. And out of that comes an understanding, therefore, of where profits come from. Profits don't come because so-and-so, Microsoft, founders of these corporations were brilliant, or they were smart, or they got in at the right time. Well, that might be a factor, but regardless, their profits, their wealth that they have amassed comes from this difference between the use value of labor and the exchange value, or the wages of labor power. I don't know what that line is there, but ignore that. So what is the basis of commodity production? This is now getting into the real dynamics of how production works under capitalism. The capitalist has money. It could be money that he inherited, or it could be money that he had previously amassed, or she had previously amassed from earlier forms of production. But regardless, they have money, and they take that money and they turn it into capital. Money and capital are not the same thing. People could have big fat bank accounts, but that doesn't in and of itself make them capitalists. It's when the owners of that wealth then employ that wealth and transform it into capital, that's what makes them capitalists. Because as a result of that motion from money to capital, what comes out at the other end, once the commodities are produced and sold on the market, is money two. And money two is not the same as money one. Money two is a lot larger. So money one, what is money one? Well, it's used in the process of production to purchase machinery, the land, whether they rent the land or they buy the land for their factory or for their operations, and other inputs that are necessary, including raw materials that come from excavation, or they could be components that are going to go into this next level of production. So, for instance, when we talk about this computer tablet, there are various components that are used and so on. So the capitalist has to purchase those components. In some cases, they may be straight raw materials. In other cases, they could be component parts of what will go into this new commodity, this new product. And of course, she has to buy labor power on the labor market. She or he has to buy, essentially purchase the labor power of unemployed workers to come into the factory to actually do the work. And so you have this process of production, this labor process, which then creates these commodities that have new value, more than the component parts, precisely because labor has acted on those other aspects of production to produce new commodities with higher value, and then those commodities, when they're sold, then produce money too. And here again, it's important to remember the dual aspect of labor power. Its use value and an exchange value that the capitalist has to pay for that worker's labor time, and usually expressed in the form of wages. So just to draw out this equation further, you have M1, which is transformed into constant capital. That's the land, that's the machinery, that's and so on, and the cost of labor, and other inputs, by the way, because some inputs are considered to be constant capital. They also, of course, lose their value over time. Machinery wears out and so on and so forth. But essentially, we can consider them to be constant capital, and the land that the factory is built on and the building itself of the factory is constant capital. Then there's other inputs, the raw materials or the components, for instance, that have to be purchased. And then the cost of labor, because you have to hire workers to actually work in the production process, and then the surplus value. And the surplus value essentially is the difference between what that worker produces in any given period of time, an 8-hour day or a 10-hour day, or in 1 week. Many workers are paid salaries as opposed to an hourly rate. In some cases, they still have piece rate, but that's less common these days. But regardless of the form that it takes, the difference between the cost of that labor and the value that that labor produces in the production process is expropriated by the capitalist in the form of surplus value. And that's the source of profit under capitalism. And of course, it comes out as money too. So the rate of exploitation, when we talk about the rate of exploitation, we're talking about what is the relationship between the surplus value on the one hand and the variable capital on the other, which is, essentially the cost of labor. So if a worker produces, let's say, 100 units of value on a given shift, but he is only paid the equivalent in terms of wages for half of that, that means that for the first 4 hours, or let's say an 8-hour shift, for the first 4 hours, he's basically being compensated for what he actually produces. But for the other 4 hours, that's free labor. That goes in the form of surplus value to the capitalist, but it's disguised. People don't understand this, and workers, for the most part, don't see how they're being exploited, because they say, well, I worked 8 hours and look at my pay slip here. It says there's my hours, there's my wages. I got paid. I got a decent day's wage for a decent day's work. Where's the exploitation? The genius, if you will, of capitalist mode of production is that it disguises the exploitation of labor, so that workers think, well, I've been paid for my time. What's the problem? I would like more wages because I have lots more expenses at home. Prices are going up, education costs are going up, and so on. But at least I'm being paid what I should be paid. And they may try to increase their wages, or usually, rather than increase their wages, they're trying to catch up because the real value of their wages is eroded because of inflation, the cost of living, and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, they don't see, because when they look at their timesheet or they look at their paycheck, they don't see how, in fact, the capitalist is getting rich. They're getting rich because they're smart, or because they're good managers, or because they came up with a brilliant idea and they have intellectual property rights for that invention. That's where their source of wealth is. It's not true. It comes directly from the production process itself, and it expresses itself in the rate of exploitation. So by comparing the surplus value that the capitalist expropriates and the variable capital, which for the most part are the wages, that then gives you what the rate of exploitation is in a given production circuit of production. So we could say that the production process under capitalism, here again, this is just further expanding on this equation. Money one becomes capital one. Capital one is transformed into fixed or constant capital, raw materials, buildings, machinery, and so on. Variable capital, the cost of labor, and the surplus value that is disguised from the worker and is expropriated by the capitalist. Then out the other end, of course, comes C2, which is capital two, in the form of commodities. But those commodities still don't enrich the capitalist until they are transformed into money. So the capitalists may be producing a lot of new commodities, and their warehouses may be stuffed to the gills with product, but it doesn't matter, because what is the capitalist going to do with 10,000 pairs of unsold shoes? So it only is meaningful to the capitalist when those new commodities, capital 2 or C2, is then exchanged in the marketplace for money 2. This is sometimes called the circuit of capital. So you have simple reproduction of capital. M1 is reinvested. So next year, capitalist says, well, this is good. I made a lot of money this year. I'm going to take some of that money and I'm going to reinvest it for the coming year. And M1 basically stays the same. I'm going to hire the same number of workers. I'm going to have the same production process, essentially, and I'll get more money at the end of a similar amount of money, assuming that market prices don't change and so on and so forth, at the end of the coming year as well. But of course, capitalists don't do that. They have what we call extended reproduction of capital, where the capitalist invests a portion of the surplus in the next cycle of production to increase output and or to invest in better machinery to further reduce the necessary labor time in the production process. So you have automation, for instance, and the capitalists will say, well, if I introduce this new technology, it'll cut down on the amount of live labor. In other words, the workers that have to be hired. Instead of hiring 20 workers to work in my shingle plant, for instance, in the forestry industry, I can just hire 2 and have these automated systems and so on and so forth. So the capitalist is motivated to take a chunk of the surplus value that's produced and reinvest it to create even more wealth. Obviously, he's going to keep a chunk of it so he can buy his villas in Switzerland and his yachts and her yachts and so on and so forth. But the capitalist understands at a gut level that in order for that capitalist to compete against other capitalists, they need to invest more, they need to bring in new technology and so on. And if they fail to do that, then they will find themselves in a weaker position and vulnerable either to bankruptcy or to takeovers and what have you. So what's the difference between the rate of surplus value and the rate of profit? This is kind of another interesting thing where people sometimes trip up. There is a big difference between the rate of surplus value and the rate of profit. The rate of surplus value is the ratio between the use value of the labor and the exchange value of the labor. We've already talked about that. Put another way, it's the ratio between surplus labor that the workers expend in production but don't get paid for, and the necessary labor that the capitalist pays in the form of wages. And this is expressed in the formula M over V times 100, which gives you a percentage indicating the rate of exploitation. So in the earlier example, where the worker works for 4 hours and gets paid essentially for those 4 hours, but the other 4 hours is free labor. He doesn't see that because the boss cunningly pays him for all 8 hours, but at half the price. So it looks like he's being paid for the full shift, but essentially he's not. So if it's 4 and 4, that means that the rate of exploitation would be 100%. The capitalist, however, is primarily concerned with the rate of profit. Capitalists don't sit around in their offices and say, wow, what is the rate of surplus value in production? They're only really interested in the rate of profit. What dividends that they pay out to their investors and so on, who, if it's a public company, have bought stocks and bonds and so on, or if it's a private capitalist firm, how much profit do they have at the end of M2 when they've completed the process. So it's a lot different than the rate of exploitation. She or he looks at the ratio of the company's profits in relation to the overall investment in capital, both the fixed capital, that's to say the constant capital, factory buildings and machinery and so on, and the circulating capital, the cost of labor, raw materials, and what have you. And it goes further because the individual capitalist is driven to invest more and more in high-tech machinery, robotics, etc., to reduce labor time. The rate of profit tends to decline over time, even if the rate of exploitation of the workers, that's to say the live labor, continues to increase. And this process is summed up in what Marx called the general law of the tendency for the rate of profit to fall, or the law of the general tendency for the rate of profit to fall. Well, I'm going to get more into that in a second, but just to emphasize this point. Why is there a difference between the surplus value that's produced and the rate of profit? Well, the capitalist can't keep all of the surplus value. He has to pay rail charges in order to move those new commodities to various markets across the country or internationally. He has to take a share of the surplus value and share that with the retailers so that they make some money too, right? The retailers, essentially, their profit comes from the production process, because the capitalist says, if the capitalist said, no, I want full value for my products, the retailers are going to say, well, what am I supposed to live on? How am I supposed to make a living? And how am I supposed to make a profit? So the capitalist has to share some of that surplus value with retailers. It also has to share it with the banks, because the banks or other financial institutions will lend him the money, and he has to pay interest, or she has to pay interest on those loans. So some portion of the surplus value also goes in the form of interest, goes in the form of rent for land and what have you. So that's why there's a difference between surplus value and the rate of profit. But capitalists are only really interested in the rate of profit. And this is the explanation about why there is a general tendency for the rate of profit to fall under capitalist production over time. So we have the organic composition of capital. And whenever we look at the process of production, we sometimes use the expression, the organic composition of capital. What is it? Well, it's a ratio, basically, between the constant capital and the variable capital. And over time, this organic composition of capital tends to grow, because the constant capital are things like technology, robotics, and so on and so forth. So as the factory becomes more high tech, if you will, and as the components that go into the final computer tablet, for instance, become more expensive in relationship to the final assembly line workers that are actually putting that product together, the organic composition of capital will change over time. So the rate of profit is the surplus compared to both the constant and the variable capital. And so this is the general law of the tendency for the rate of profit to fall. And people, this is something that even Marxist political economists or would-be Marxist economists argue about incessantly. Marx was wrong. There is no tendency for the rate of profit to fall. Well, here's an interesting graph. This is about the US economy since World War II. The rate of profit went on a steady decline. Sometimes there were some variations and so on, but you can see obviously the direction, which is for the tendency for the rate of profit to decline, and rather sharply in a way, from 1947 to basically the early 1980s. This is what had capitalists in a fever pitch in the late 70s and early 80s, and they said enough of this welfare state stuff, enough of Keynesian economics. We need a new model, and they adapted and used the writings of Milton Friedman and the Chicago School and supply side economics, and essentially what became known as neoliberalism, to reverse this sharp decline in the rate of profit. And by the way, they were quite successful in temporarily reversing this slide, and they did it through a number of means. I'll just leave that on the screen here for now. What were those means? Well, First of all, they attacked the trade union movement. And this was an attempt to not only weaken the capacity of unions to struggle for wage increases, which obviously dug into their profits, but also to weaken the density of organized labor within the working class as a whole. So it's not by accident that you see in country after country after country, whether you look at France or Britain or Canada or the United States, to varying degrees, but nevertheless, the density of unionization has declined precipitously, particularly since the early 1980s. They also do it by changing the intensity of labor. So you have people working longer than they used to. Instead of the benefits of increases in productivity from, new levels of technology and whatnot, workers are working longer hours. They're putting what comes out the other end in terms of their expenses, whether it's housing or food or education or transportation or whatever it is outpacing their incomes. They also, of course, the capitalists also do it through increasing the centralization and concentration of capital in the form of monopolies. And I'm sure that Jean will get into this more when she deals with historical materialism. And of course, they also do it by cutting corporate taxes. So interestingly enough, at the end of the Second World War, the share of corporate taxes of the overall pool of resources of governments was almost 50%. That is to say, 50% came from things like the income taxes that workers paid. The other 50% came in the form of corporate taxes. Today, the percentage is less than 10%. I can't remember what the most recent figures are, but it's something like 6 or 7%. And the other 94% comes from income taxes, other forms of taxation like sales taxes and so on and so forth, which fall, of course, the burden of that falls most heavily on the working class. So the capitalists essentially are always struggling to not only maintain, but even increase their rate of profit, how much they make at the end of the year in relationship to how much they invested at the beginning of the year. And in order to do that, they are driven by the system itself. It's not that they're good capitalists and bad capitalists. They act as they do because they're driven to act as they do. I'm not making apologetics for capitalists here, but it's important, being scientific socialists, to understand the real dynamic that's at work here and why it replicates itself over and over and over again in country after country after country. It's because of this inner dynamics of the capitalist production process. So I hope, and I'm going to end now because I've probably gone way over time, and my apologies, but I hope that this makes some sense to you. I encourage you to do more reading, and if you did read those selections from Karl Marx, read them again, and hopefully it will make even more sense. But there's some really wonderful pieces of profundity, if you will, in that selection. And of course, here's some other readings as well. This is being recorded, so it'll be available to everybody online. But also, if anybody wants the text, if they want either this PowerPoint presentation or the text that's embedded in this PowerPoint presentation, we can make this available as well. Just let us know. So I'm so sorry for the time. I'll end right there.
All right. Thank you very much, Miguel. So there's a couple of questions here. Two people have brought this up, basically, which is there a Marxist explanation for luxury products? For example, obviously, some of the things that are sold, like shoes for $800, aren't. That's what. How does a Marxist consider what luxury products are within the capitalist economy? Oh, you're muted still.
Sorry about that. Yeah, it's an interesting question and whatnot. I've never really thought that much about this question, but obviously, luxury, of course, is a socially determined concept. Yes, and the capitalist class, part of their maintaining their image of being exceptional in society and deserving of the power that they're able to exercise both in the economy and also on the political life of society, have to live a luxurious life and get the rest of us to follow it on People magazine and the homes of the rich and the famous and so on and so forth. And they pay a premium to be able to present that. Yeah. So obviously, these mansions that are, $20 million or more aren't really worth $20 million. But the capitalist is willing to do it. And anyway, they're enriching themselves hand over fist anyway. So they're quite comfortable with doing it because that is their lot in life. They are the ruling class and they want to behave and be seen to have, just like under feudalism, the aristocracy had this, they wanted gold emboldened clothing and big castles and so on and so forth, because this was a reflection of their God-given right to rule society, and serfs beware, and slaves and slave-owning society to beware of the slave owners, and so on. So I guess that explains why, in fact, you could say that the price or the value, the exchange value of luxury goods is somewhat different from what we would consider the mass pool of commodities that are produced.
A second question here, just let me read it. Could it be said that the tendency of the rate of profit to fall is one, if not the main driving force behind imperialism and the search for new markets, and access to cheaper variable capital? A second part of the question is, what is the solution of capital when there are no markets to secure? Mass capital destruction via imperialist war?
Wow, those are two heavy questions. Well, first of all, you're quite right. When I referred to neoliberalism, I was running way behind time. I didn't go into this extensively. But of course, part of neoliberalism is the so-called globalization agenda of allowing for the free movement of capital. When you talk about these free trade agreements, they're not so much about trade, and they're certainly not very much about the free movement of workers. Those borders are still up there and immigration is still up there. As a matter of fact, immigration has even been tightened. We could get into the European Union. It's a little bit of a different question there, but in general, it has primarily to do with the free movement of capital. So to move capital from one area where the variable labor costs are higher to areas where they can pay lower wages and therefore generate increased wealth. So yes, obviously there is a connection between the rise of imperialism with this effort. But again, it's not a conscious thing that the capitalists say, aha, we need imperialism so that we can lower the cost of labor, therefore increasing our profits, therefore reversing this general tendency for the rate of profits to fall. It happens, you could say, autonomously from will. It happens objectively in the very logic of capitalism. And it's precisely because it's in the very essence of capitalism that shows that any thoughts of reforming capitalism, of making it fairer or more just, is absolute, an illusion. It has no basis in reality because it doesn't address the fundamental contradictions and dynamics of capitalist development.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going through some of the chat here because I think there's some other questions. Okay. What is the view on scalping in Marxism? I assume this is related to tickets. There are people and or bots who buy a good amount of a limited stock of a newly released product, and the company who released the product can't restock fast enough to keep up with demand, and then sell them on third-party websites like eBay and hike the price 2 times or more than the official price of said product. I don't know what.
Sure. Yes. You know, this is an interesting question, and of course, it has applications not just today, but in the past as well, where and a lot of this has to do with you know the capacity of those who own and control the means of production to use it for their own benefit, to price gouge. And of course, there will be a section of that class who will take advantage of supply and demand to super exploit people, to raise the prices of concert tickets and so on and so forth, until somehow the market adjusts and you know, more venues are put on, more concerts are organized because there's a bigger demand to hear this rock band than the amount of seats in the auditorium and so on. And so you have these you know, gougers who will be around the edges of production and exchange, who try to profit on the benefit on that basis. The same way, for instance, you have short selling on the stock market. You know, you gamble and whatnot in order to bet against the market, and through so doing, of course, you create the conditions for gouging. And people think that that's where profits come from. Smart entrepreneurs who are, you know, find a niche and whatnot. Well, yes, in a certain sense, that's true, because they're able to extract a price that's higher than the intrinsic value of that given commodity at any given point. But that isn't the essence of the production of surplus value. Even if all prices were absolutely in line with their intrinsic exchange value in the market, in other words, supply and demand was always in sync and whatnot, profits would still be produced. And the source of those profits is not because of cunning guys like scalpers and whatnot, or shrewd marketeers who find a new niche in the market and whatnot. Essentially, it comes right from the production process itself and the expropriation of that labor time, that surplus value in the production process.
Thank you. There's another question, which is, can you talk more about the distinction between personal and private property?
Sure. Well, I mean, so we all have personal property, and often, of course, the ideologues of capitalism and those who denigrate socialism try to present it like, well, you know, under socialism, you don't own anything. You have no right to your personal property. I spent the first 8 years of my school years actually in the States. My family had moved from Quebec to New York, and I went to the school systems in the U.S. And it was during the Cold War. And of course, one of the things that we were taught was that those communists will come into your house at 3 o'clock in the morning and take all of your toys. You know, so there's no such thing as personal property under socialism. And of course, this is a lie. There is a fundamental difference between personal property and private property. Private property is what is used and transformed into capital to then exploit labor. So there's a world of difference between personal property and private property.
Okay, thank you. Another question. If I understand correctly, the tendency for the rate of profit to fall is predicated on an ever-increasing efficiency in production. However, at a certain point, physical limits will be reached, i.e. soil no longer being as fertile, metals not being as easy to extract. What will happen to the rate of profit when these limits are hit?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, we have to be careful here because we shouldn't conflate the costs of inputs, let's say natural resources, with upgrading the constant capital in the form of machinery and technology. But nevertheless, it's an important question. What happens, for instance, when AI starts taking over everything, as we see it's happening? And by the way, during this period of the pandemic, capitalists are using these conditions to make further modifications in the labor process so that they can implement more and more of these labor-saving technologies, so that even after the pandemic is long past, the workplace will be virtually unrecognizable, and there will be a further, you could say, not only the creation of a temporary pool or surplus of the unemployed, but permanently marginalized sections of the working class. And if you are into futurology and science fiction and whatnot, you'll be familiar with rather pessimistic visions of what that could mean down the road. That 75% of the population is permanently marginalized and either are considered, obviously they're unproductive, but are considered also wasteful, and so they are killed off, or else they're kept on survival basic universal incomes, not livable incomes as we call for, but basic incomes, all for the benefit of the further enrichment of the capitalist class and its monopoly core. Of course, there are other examples in the future which are much more progressive, and Star Trek is one of them, where you have, in fact, a future society which has transgressed capitalism and really where all of the needs of all of the people can be met, and people can develop their capacities, their interests, their skills in just pursuit of knowledge and a better understanding of the world, of the universe, and what have you. And commodities no longer have a value, but that requires, but the capitalists will never just surrender on their own, and that's why you need, in fact, a socialist revolution. I see you still have your screen on, so I get the message. We should wrap up very soon here.
Well, there is one more. So we'll do one more question, and then we'll take a bit of a break for people to go to the bathroom, get coffee, get food, or whatever they want. So I'll put. It's a very good question, I think. If Value, Price, and Profit was written as a refutation of Weston saying that any wage gains made by workers would be canceled out by capitalists simply raising prices, how do we as Marxists combat this in our organizing? For example, in movements like Fight for 15, when we come up against the same argument today?
Right. Well, there's actually a really interesting quote in the readings that were assigned or given out to you, and I'm going to see if I can find it here because I think it's wonderful, where he deals with this question of wages and the fact that, as important as those struggles are, they are dealing with the effects of capitalism and not with its basic core. Yeah, it's a wonderful quote. I can't seem to find it right now. But anyway, you will find it if you go through that selection, and that workers are always struggling to prevent further erosions of the value of their wages. And so you find, for instance, strikes that are fought, and at the end of it, if they're even victorious, all that they have won is some sort of cost of living index, which temporarily maintains the real purchasing power for workers. And even where they're successful, and of course there have been periods where the working class has been successful in raising the real wages for their class, this has happened for other reasons. For instance, in the post-war period, it happened because the imperialist powers were worried about the alternative of socialism and the Soviet Union and the examples in Eastern Europe and whatnot. So they temporarily granted various reforms which increased the social wage of people in the form of unemployment insurance, healthcare, other social services and public services and so on, which in a sense are really part of the value of wages. But they did it for class reasons because they were worried about the alternative of socialism. And as soon as socialism was overturned in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, you had then the onslaught with austerity and what have you to take back a lot of the gains which working people had won. They started to take it back even before the end of socialism, as I referred to earlier, under Reagan and Thatcher and so on, and these ultra-right efforts. But of course, it gained momentum because there was no longer perceived, at least, to be an alternative to the capitalist order.
Okay, there are more questions, but I think we should probably take a little bit of a break for people. So, and if Miguel's feeling frisky, he can jump in and chat with people, but maybe we'll do about 15 or 20 minutes. I'll play some music. People can get food, coffee, tea, go to the bathroom or anything like that. Continue chatting, of course. So we'll be back at, let's say 3:20 then. Thank you, everyone.
Le vent souffle en Arizona, un état d'Amérique dans lequel Arizona. Cowboy dingue, du bang bang, du flingue, de l'arme, du cheval et de quoi faire la bringue. Poursuivi par Smith et Wesson, Colt, Derringer, Winchester et Remington. Il erre dans les plaines, fier, solitaire. Son cheval est son partenaire. Parfois, il rencontre des Indiens, mais la rue est vers l'or et son seul dessin. Sa vie suit un cours que l'on connaît par cœur. La rivière sans retour d'Otto Preminger, tandis que John Wayne est looké à la Lucky Luke, propre comme un archiduc. Oncle Sam me doute, Hollywood nous berne, Hollywood berne, dans la vie de tous les jours comme dans les nouveaux westerns. On dit gare aux gorilles, mais gare à Gary Cooper. Le western moderne est installé dans le secteur. Quand la ville dort, les trains ne sifflent pas. Les 7 mercenaires n'ont pas l'once d'un combat. Harry, désormais, est proche de Gare de l'Est. Il sauve des époques les lieux pour un nouveau Far West. Les saloons sont des bistrots, on y vend des clopes. Pas de la chip, du top, du cinémascope. Il entre dans le bar, commande un indien, scalpe la mousse, boit, repose le verre sur le zin. Une touche cheveux se part, sous, des types se baignent pour des motifs futiles comme dans les nouveaux westerns. Les States sont une sorte de multinationale. Elle exporte le western et son modèle féodal. Dicte le bien, le mal, Lucky Luke et les Dalton sont camouflés en Paul Smith et Weston. On dit que ce qui compte c'est le décor. La vie ne fait pas le moine dans la rue et vers l'or. Dès lors, les techniques se perfectionnent. La carte à puce remplace le Remington. Mais Harry, à Paris, n'a pas eu de chance. On le stoppe sur le périph' avec sa diligence. Puis on le place à freine, pour que freine, le freine. Victime des directives de ce que l'on appelle le nouveau western. Le nouveau western. Parfois, la vie ressemble à une balle perdue. Dans le système moderne se noie l'individu. Pour rester lucide, il s'approvait de brandy. Désormais, on brandit téléchité baby. Ou blanche et la chevauchée fantastique. Toujours à contre-jour, c'est bien moins héroïque. Dans le monde du rêve, on termine par un happy end. Est-ce aussi le cas dans ce que l'on nomme le nouveau western? Le nouveau western. Le nouveau western. Le nouveau western. Le nouveau western. Moderne. Le nouveau western. Moderne. Le nouveau western. Sitting Bull. Koshi. Calamity Jam, West, Jam, les Squaws, les Scal, Tomahawk, le nouveau western, le nouveau western, moderne, Lucky, Billy, Miguelito Loveless.
Okay, everyone, thank you very much. We are back. So you can't see me, I'm off screen here. Give everybody just a chance. Our next presenter is Jean McGuire. I will allow her to introduce herself and say hello to everyone. So thank you.
Hello to everyone. My name is Jean McGuire, and today I'm going to try and present the basics of understanding Marxist philosophy, historical and dialectical materialism. And I have to say, following Miguel is always so difficult because he is so thorough and so encompassing that I always end up thinking, oh my goodness, you know, he's just done it. So I'm sorry there's going to be some overlap. Just that's the way it is. And you'll have to just, yeah, it's good. You know, it's called review. I'm the review section of this today. So we're starting, and as I said, my goal is so that when you leave here today, you have a more thorough understanding of the concepts of dialectics and materialism. And then again, I'm going to repeat some of the stuff that Miguel did, which deals with some of the core concepts of Marxism, Leninism. So more Marxism, but you know, so let's start by just pointing out that philosophy as a whole category, not just Marxist philosophy, but philosophy is really divided into two basic, there's a divide in philosophy. There is materialism and there's idealism. And really in philosophy, people fall on one side of that divide or the other. But before I tell you what materialism is, let me tell you what it is not. Materialism is not being materialistic, and idealism is not being idealistic. So in other words, to be a materialist does not mean you hanker after material goods, and to be an idealist does not mean you have high ideals. It means that the way you perceive the cause of things is based on material reality or based on what's on in your head. Idealists think that the most primary variable affecting people's behavior and the whole society's behavior is ideas. And materialists believe that the basic unit for understanding why things exist is what goes on the ground, the material reality. So that's what we're looking at when we're talking about historical materialism. We're talking about having an understanding of that reality based on the material foundations of materialism. So what I'm going to try and do is break it down for you. And do not worry if you cannot see this sheet, because it's really just a prop for me. I've got to have something to do while I'm talking to you. Otherwise, unlike others, I can't just sort of sit there and talk very well. I'm kind of moving. So I need something to prop up. I have all these comments are already available in the form of notes, and you will get them. They won't be all my comments on the side, but the core elements of what I'm talking about will be sent to you via email after this is done. So I don't want you to be scrabbling down everything. If it's good for you to do that as a mechanism of learning, go ahead, but you will get it otherwise. So dialectics. And I divide everything into four. Doesn't matter whether it's four or not, goes into four. What are dialectics? So there are four principles to dialectics. And I must say this about dialectics. When you hear it, well, that's pretty common sense. Yeah, that's pretty common sense. And most of it is. Almost everything is of dialectics is common sense once you break it down and look at it. So the first principle of dialectics, and as I said, don't worry about it. I'm not even going to write the whole thing out. As I say, I'm using it as a prop. The first principle is that everything is interrelated. Okay? Everything is interrelated. And you know what? That's a very common thought these days. Ever since we heard about ecosystems, we understand that the world is interrelated. the physical world. We talk about it as in terms of its interrelation and the physical world, but it's also true of the social world. If you have a pandemic, you know there's going to be a consequence in violence, tension, stress, unemployment. So everything is interrelated. And the relationship can be immediate and profound. It can be distant and profound, and it could be distant and pretty minimal. But the fact is, there's going to be links. So the link to certain social situations is related to other social variables. The second principle, change is constant. And as I said, all of these thoughts are really quite simplistic, simple sounding, but when they add together, they provide a package of understanding that is pretty important. So change is constant, and you know that, obviously. But the way the world is today is not the way it was yesterday. The way you are today is not the way you were yesterday. Things have changed. You're one day older, something happened, you know, you got COVID, that's different, whatever, all sorts of things in the world is different today than it was yesterday. And again, some of those changes are profound and some of those changes are not, but they are there. The third principle, that change, and here it's getting hard for me to write, so don't worry about it. Change goes from quantitative change to qualitative change. And again, that's a common thought. We don't always articulate it, but it's a very common thought that change goes from quantitative to qualitative. And that means that the character of the change is one by one by one by one, or some unit increases. And then at a certain point, boom, that thing is something different. Clear examples. If you add a degree of temperature to water, you know where I'm going. 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, boom. It's not water anymore, it's steam. That's a qualitative change. But the cause of that qualitative change was the incremental increase of temperature one by one by one by one. Change goes from quantitative to qualitative. In all sorts of areas, that happens. You see it all the time. If you add 1,000 unemployed, it's 1,000 unemployed. If they're probably just looking for a job, they didn't like the last one, they're going somewhere else. Add another 1,000, add another 1,000, add another 1,000, add another 10,000, add another 10,000. You go from unemployed people to a march on, I don't know, onto Ottawa Trek. That's unemployment. That's a social problem. That's different than 1,000 people unemployed. And that occurs, that's our understanding of the way the world works as Marxists, is that is the process. Things will accumulate, and at a certain point they'll change. They'll change qualitatively. And the last element of dialectics is the principle of dynamic contradiction. And again, don't worry, it's coming to you in notes. The principle of dynamic contradiction. So the first thing to be said about a dynamic contradiction is a contradiction is not a problem. A problem you can try and solve. A problem you can take apart and say, okay, how do we deal with this problem? A problem is when your computer doesn't work and you have to solve that problem. A problem is there's an intersection that needs a traffic light, you solve that problem. A contradiction is a problem that you cannot get around. It is embedded in the very nature of that thing. And I use the example all the time that I used to go to the gym when we didn't have a pandemic. And there were young people who worked in the gym. And I once said to one of them, I'm not going to win this, you know. Maybe I can modify it. I can maybe extend it. But my struggle to overcome death isn't going to be victorious. I cannot win that because the contradiction of life is death. Rocks don't die because they're not alive. If you are alive, it means death. And that's a contradiction. You can't get around it, no matter what you do. As I said, you can modify it, you can ameliorate it, you put it off, but you can't overcome it. And that's what we talk about when we talk about a contradiction in the social system. We mean they cannot solve it. You can't overcome the contradictions of capitalism by wiggling and jiggling the policies. It won't work, not in the long run. It may work temporarily, but it's not going to work in the long run. Excuse me, this is a very kind of awkward thing here. Okay, that's dialectics. And we'll be looking at how we apply that in a minute. This next part of that is materialism. And materialism, again, we're going to do 4 principles of materialism. And the first principle of materialism is that matter develops before mind. Okay, so matter, materialism, mind, ideas. Okay, I'm using mind to just be as a category. Matter develops before mind. Now that is in fact evolutionarily correct. We had to have a brain in order to think. You can't think without a brain. And the development of that brain is what made us human, obviously, and it developed before the thinking processes. So humans actually had that whole long evolutionary process which allowed for the development of the brain, and that process, having begun, also became the process that allowed for the ideas to develop within that brain. But it's also true in the very lower level of that. So for instance, you do not have people talking about how to use electricity to power a car unless you have electricity. So you had steam power, for instance. You had factories based on machinery that would be powered perhaps by steam. Well, now they're powered by electricity. But you had to have electricity before somebody could say, how are we going to do this? How could we make this, use this new form? But it had to exist. You know, I use the joke about going camping, and when you cook over an outdoor fire and your back is breaking because you're doing that, or your knees are breaking because you're squatting there, I always used to say, what I need is an electric stove. But I could say that. The people who spent their entire lives cooking over a fire never said that, couldn't say that, wasn't possible. The material basis of that statement did not exist. So you have to have a material basis, and then the mind kicks off from that. That does not mean that they're not linked, obviously. So the second principle of materialism is that matter and mind are interrelated. That's interrelated. Matter and mind are interrelated. And that's exactly what we're talking about. You know, somebody looks at a lightning thing and thinks, there's a lot of power in that. I wonder if that, what does that, and then away they go. Their brain is thinking about it. I mean, the human brain is really a phenomenal thing. This is in no way a diminution of the enormous significance of the brain. The brain is powerful. And some people's brains are really even more powerful than others. I was thinking about it today as I was preparing for this, about how Einstein is in the streetcar and turns around and looks at a clock. And from that, the man manages to get together the theory of relativity, which, okay, that, I mean, you know, looking at it and thinking, well, if I was going fast enough, time would stand still But that's not what he did. He went way beyond that. He started doing theories about energy and mass. Ooh, right. Talk about a brain, right? But they're interrelated. You have to have something to work the brain on, the idea system. And that's what human beings do. Human beings take their physical reality, the material reality they have, and they massage it, they mold it, they modify it, they make different things out of it. They take a look at a piece of bone and see the potential for a needle or a button, right? They're all doing that. Our whole history is a process of moving forward with the things we make. That's what humans do. Humans make things. They modify their reality and then they make tools to make things. It's a phenomenal process and really impressive. Matter can be influenced. Matter can be influenced by mind, but matter is prior. The mind can influence the matter as we do when we change it, but the matter is prior, not only in terms of anthropological development in the sense of it has to exist before, but also in terms of significance. I want to just give you an example, the one that I like the best for the fact that the material world is more significant than the mental world is to ask you to imagine a new color. And before you waste too much time doing that, let me tell you, you can't do it. You cannot imagine a new color. Your brain can't do that. Now, it looks like you can. If you go into a paint store, you think that there is an infinite number of colors that the human being can see, but that is not true. What human beings see is red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Roy G. Biv, and that's it. Nothing else. You can't go beyond that. And why? Not because your brain is limited, but because the colors you see are determined by the gray rods in the back of your brain, the back of your eyes, and those are the only colors that the human eye can see. Now, what's significant is we know there are other colors. We even have names for those other colors. Infrared and ultraviolet. We know they're there. We know certain things may even see them. And we don't even know how many there are. There may be 200 on either side. How do we know? Because we can't see them. You put light through a prism and you will see the range of colors that human beings can see. And that is red, orange, green, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, boom, done. That's the material world. That is the notion. Now, you can take it and massage it, as I said. You can affect that. You can make the greens different greens. You can add blues to the greens. You can add blues to the yellows, blue, all that kind of stuff. You can mix it up. But you got to work with, and even if the human eye, let's say your eye, modified through some genetic mutation and you were able to see that another color, you would not be able to tell me what it was because I couldn't see it, because I'm going to be limited. So even if things change. So matter can be modified by the mind or influenced by it, but the matter is prior and more important. And the fourth principle of materialism, and I'm not going to write this out because it's too far down, everything is potentially knowable. Everything is potentially knowable. Because that's fundamental to being a materialist. Now, doesn't mean we're going to know it. Doesn't mean you or your children or your grandchildren or your great-grandchildren are going to know everything. And there may, in fact, be a capacity where human beings sort of like hit the wall. We don't know that because we haven't got there yet, and I'm not going to assume that that's possible. The point is that if the world is material, then I can feel it, gauge it, measure it, look at it, describe it, understand it. And that's what's important. Nothing is beyond our ability to look and describe and understand. And they have to assume that, because if you don't assume that, essentially what you're giving off is something that is beyond. It's supernatural, and we don't. We believe in the material world and the ability to comprehend that material world. So what does Marxism do? Marxism says that this is how we understand that. That describes anything, by the way. You could use this to, I mean, there are essentially dialectical materialists in all fields, science, etc., because of course it makes sense. This is quite, I mean, a lot of the natural scientists are actually natural dialectical materialists because it makes sense. Evolution is a dialectical materialist assessment of how things come into being. They're using it to understand the natural world. But we're using it because this is our area of concern, is society. So we're saying that we're using this analysis to understand society. So the question then is, what is the material basis that we're going to study in order to, what is the material what is the matter that is the substance of history? And as Miguel got into today, and what we want to look at, the material reality that drives social systems, the matter for society is production. You don't have production. Well, that's not quite true, because I used to say that humans in their present form had been around for about 200,000 years. Now, there was a lot of things that were very close to human for about 300 before that. But I recently, when I was doing the presentation on angles, I thought I should go just look into this. And I just, it tells you how long it is since I really looked at this stuff, that they've moved that back almost to 300,000 years, that the human beings in our present form have been around closer to 300,000 years, whereas I thought it was 200,000 because that's what it used to be. That's what they assumed. So about 280,000. Now, for most of that time, we actually didn't engage in production. Because production means that you actually change, as Miguel talked about, you apply labor and alter some element of nature. But for most of our time on the earth, we essentially foraged. So we weren't producing food, we were gathering food. Yes, and sometimes we hunted it, but if you were relying on hunting, you would die. You had to rely on foraging. That was the basis of most of our time on this earth, has been spent foraging for food. That was it. That's essentially all we did. We did make some clothes and we did make some other things, but what our time was spent roaming around trying to find enough to keep us alive. But we're going to call that production because in one sense it's not producing it, but if you didn't do it, you weren't going to be alive. And once you got past that, then you're actually acting, conscious labor being applied to derive certain products, that comes into being. But at every stage, it is the ability to satisfy our material existence that shapes our social system. And we're going to be taking a look at how that shapes up. And I'll be, again, as I said, duplicating some of what Miguel talked about, but that's good. It's always good to talk about it again, because this is fundamental. This is the basics. You really got to get it under. So the matter, the material that Marxists are considering is production. That is the dialectics of it. Then we apply dialectics to that matter of production. And what do we find? Change is constant. Change goes from quantitative to qualitative. The principle of dynamic contradiction. That is part and parcel of our understanding of what goes on in a society in production. That changes are going to be occurring in production, and that those changes will sooner or later change qualitatively. In production will change qualitatively, and when production changes qualitatively, there will be the necessity to alter the social system based on changes in the material base of that social system. So we're going to go through this again with Miguel's categories, because this is what historical materialism applies to. And I'm using somewhat different terms, just a matter of preference. The first stage of human society, we talk about as early communalism. And I prefer communalism because it's not communism in a sense. Communism, in my sense, is that there is a conscious organization of change of society in order to achieve a certain thing. And this flowed directly out of what was going on. It was not a conscious effort to alter reality. It reflected what was going on in their social system. So early communalism is all of that period that we spent foraging. And the only way that that society can exist and prosper to the point of actually going beyond just survival is, in fact, if it's communal. You don't last. In fact, we know that it's true that you don't survive outside of the community, or that whatever the size and scope of that community is, sometimes small groups, sometimes larger groups, sometimes quite complex larger groups. But we know that that's fundamental, because one of the ways you actually punish people is to drive them out. You say, get out of this group. And if they're on their own, they're not going to last very long. And certainly they're not going to last in the sense of a next generation. And if you're on your own, there's not a next generation likely to be coming. So early communalism reflects the level of production, the nature of that production. And that production is social. And the relations of production are social as well. Now, what happens within that is you get the slow and very slow, obviously, 290,000 or 280,000. And the first beginnings of breaking of that happened about 13,000 years ago. And we'll talk about what that is. But that is an incredibly long period of incremental changes in what? In tools. In the ability to organize the food search in different ways. And the thing that breaks this is the Neolithic Revolution. And some of you will have heard me talk about this, as I said when I talked about Engels a week ago. The Neolithic Revolution, about 13,000 years ago, is the domestication of plants and animals. And you can see what happened. I mean, you're gathering the berries and you're gathering the berries, and you dropped a berry, and the next year there was a plant that had berries. Okay, let's see if I could do that again. I mean, no, not obviously, as I said, that we're talking 200 and some thousand years of figuring all those things out. You're hunting those animals, it's got to come into your brain at some point. If I could figure out a way to pen them in, I wouldn't have to chase them. And chasing for humans is really hard because, of course, we can only walk and animals run. So, you know, penning a bunch of animals in is a real advance. And that occurs in the Neolithic Revolution, about 13,000 years ago, plus or minus. What's significant about the Neolithic Revolution is that for the first time in human history with that, we were able to consistently produce more than we were actually required to survive. Our ability to grow and produce food actually exceeded our individual consumption for the first time. And obviously it's not immediate. You know, the first time you do it temporarily. There's a whole long period of time when your use of the for instance, basic horticultural techniques would have been seasonal. You would have done that in the summertime, and in the wintertime you would have roamed off and done your hunting. The other thing about it is you maybe didn't have a whole lot of ways to protect that food or store that food. So it didn't always last for a whole lot, but over time. And what you get with this Neolithic Revolution is the beginning of horticulture. And if you're doing animals, if the animal is the major one, we refer to it as pastoralism. And again, don't worry about writing all this down. It's kind of in, well, no, actually, maybe that isn't pastoralism. I don't really break it down in my notes. But anyway, horticultural and pastoralism are the first stages of the Neolithic Revolution, the domestication of plants and the domestication of animals. Now, also, which we talked about in the Engels lecture, is horticulture tended to be female dominated. Pastoralism tends to be male dominated, and you can see why, because the women were out there with the roots and the berries, and the men were the ones who did the animals, so it kind of flowed. And by the way, horticultural societies are almost invariably matrilineal and quite often matrilocal, meaning you measure your kinship through your mother's line, matrilineal. You lived with your mother's clan, matrilocal. Pastoral societies are more often patrilineal and patrilocal. Not always, but we're moving in that direction. As that grows, as you get those incremental changes in the development of plants and animals, and you begin to figure out better ways, and you're understanding, okay, let's see what happens if I do this. So this plant grew better. Why did it grow better? It grew better because there was something different about that soil. So you're beginning to learn fertility. You're beginning to learn the role of water. And as you grow through that, you get to agriculture. Agriculture is horticulture. Agriculture is horticulture on a wider scale, and quite often with the addition of things like irrigation, fertilization, etc. But it's just the domestication of plants and animals carried to a higher level through that incremental growth of productive variables, new tools, new systems of doing things. The water wheel. If you have a water wheel, you can do irrigation, that sort of thing. So agriculture happens. Now with agriculture, you're talking, as we said last week, private property. Now property, now land becomes more important. And in the pre-agricultural stage, access to resources was always essentially communal. It wasn't just that everything about it was communal. You worked together, but your access to all the resources of life were also communal. As I said, they had to be. But once you get into agriculture, and let's take a look at, if you apply your just common sense to this, you can see why. Once you start growing food, you're not walking together with other people to do something. You're working on your own. You start planting your own little bit. Over time, it becomes your land, not because somebody gave it to you, but by virtue of the fact that you're the one that's working that. And maybe it's you and your kids and your family are working that land. And then the next generation of your family is working that land. And again, these things are slow, very incremental, but you get to the point where you have land being the basis of your social system and control of that land. Your standard of living is now based on the quality of that land, your ability to work that land, your experience and knowledge about how to grow land. It's all there. But the land itself is what's important. So you want to keep that land, because that land means you eat better. If it's fertile, you want it. And if you don't have fertile soil and the person over there does, you might want theirs. I'm talking about not just within your collective, but between collectives. You can have whole people saying, you know what, we need to drive those people off because they got water. And look at their plants are growing and we don't. So we want theirs. So you begin to get this privatization of land and the defense and maintenance of that ownership of land. With that, you get two different systems historically developed. The first one is slavery. And as I said, Neolithic Revolution means that for the first time in history, people produce a surplus. Now, you do not have slavery if the person you have as a slave consumes as much as they produce. So unless you have the capacity to produce a surplus, there is no basis for class differentiation. You can have ranks, And that's not class. That's really respect based on other things, perceived knowledge about a particular field. So you could have a rank of chieftain or shaman or something of that sort, but that's not a class. A class means differential access to the resources that are available. Okay, so, and I will give you a definition of class before we finish, so don't worry about that. But you do not have slaves before you have the capacity to produce a surplus, because there's no sense to it. Well, you might, and then there are some societies, there is at least one that I can think of where you have slaves. There is a bit of surplus, but there isn't a lot of capacity to save that surplus. And slaves are just kind of, well, it's a weird system, and we don't need to get into it, but it's the only one that I can think of where slavery kind of advances over the productive capacity. And it was based on conquest. So anyway, so slavery is your first class society. And that's based on the capacity of the individual slave to produce more than they consume. It also is the basis, and I mentioned this in the production and the discussion last week, it's also the basis for a change in childbearing, because pre horticulture, agriculture, more agriculture, pre that, the whole issue of childbirth and the number of children, you don't have a lot of children under foraging societies, sometimes called hunting and gathering societies. As I said, you don't have a lot of children in that society, and how you achieve that, well, there's a lot of guesstimations about that, of how they did that. And it may have been just death of children, because it's a very hard life, you know, when you're foraging. But once you get into surplus, children now become the producers of surplus. Under foraging, children consume surplus. You're hunting and you're feeding them. You're foraging, you're feeding them. Under agriculture, the child will produce more than the child will consume at a certain stage. And the earlier you can get them out on the land, the better. And that's why children work at a very early age in agriculture. And that's why you have more of them. And moreover, not only they do produce a surplus for you, when you can no longer produce a surplus, their surplus provides for you, and that's called your social security. So the first system is slavery. Now, every society has a contradiction. And what is the contradiction in slavery? Well, there's two, really, and they're linked together, I suppose, or there may be three, but they're all linked. They're all part and parcel of the same contradiction. The thing about a slave society, and humans always think about how can we do this better. As I said, the whole thing about human beings is they look at material world, whatever it is, whether it's the existence of a computer and how can I make this computer work different ways for me, or the existence of a plow and how can I make that different and how can I make it better. Whatever we are looking at, we're always shifting it around, scrabbling it about, making it new, you know, taking the wheels from that and adding it to that and putting something else in front of it, and you got something else. So we do that. But the people who do that are the people who actually work at it. So the people who make developments in agriculture are people who are working in agriculture for the most part, or people who are thinking about it because of its significance in your social system. The problem with slave, and the reason we do that is, of course, if I can make it better, I'm going to eat better. If I can make this more productive, I'm going to do better. I'm going to have a higher standard of living. More of my children will live, more of my whatever. I mean, all of that happens because I'm making things better and more efficient and more productive. The problem for the slave is there's no advantage to the slave to devise better ways to do it. Now, that doesn't stop them. They actually did devise better ways, but it wasn't a built-in push towards the improvement of the forces of production in slavery. Because the way, if you're a slave owner and you want to get better, you want to be richer, the way to do it, add slaves. That's how you're going to expand and improve your standard of living, is you just add slaves. That's a contradiction. That's a problem that you can't really solve, because if that's the way to do it, what are you doing? You're adding enemies to your household. Scary. Maybe if you don't treat them so well, they may not treat you so well when they decide to, this is enough. I've had it. I don't care anymore. Get out of my way. So The problem for slavery is that it is based on a group of people producing who have no investment in that production at all. Whatever they get fed is not based on their labor. It's based on, in the sense of how much they labor, how well they labor, but it's based on the whim of a slave owner. They can take everything you own, or you produce, and give you what they think you deserve, or more likely, what will keep you alive till tomorrow. And that's it. So you have no investment in that social system. And we know that, in fact, you had a slave society, you got slave uprisings all the time, all the time. What you also get is the exclusion from production of a whole lot of other people, because you can take something like Rome, you got slave owners, you got slaves. What the hell are the rest of the people doing? Because not all Romans were slave owners. And if you were a slave, you weren't likely a Roman. You were in Rome. You might have been a slave somewhere else if you were a Roman, but if you're in Rome, the slaves come from somewhere else. You get them through conquest, and we can talk about the nature of slavery there if we need to, but the point is there are slaves, slave owners, and others, the free people, the citizens, and they become a source of instability. I once, when I was teaching history at one point, I actually worked out this incredible graph of like the last 300 years of Roman history, in which I tracked each emperor and what they did to try and solve the problem, because they had a number of problems. They had the problem of the slaves, they had the problems of the citizenry, they also had the problem of the provinces, which they had conquered and which were always uprising against them. So it was it was really an unstable situation. Now it looked stable because it went on, it seemed to go on for a long time, but it was a very unstable situation comparatively. And it was that this disconnect between the people producing and the investment in that production. There wasn't any, and it disintegrated. So, so one emperor would come in and say, we're going to satisfy the provinces. And the next one would come in and say, no, what we got to do is find ways to keep our citizenry distracted. Bread and circuses is the classic line that we use for the distraction of citizens who are disaffected. When you take a look at feudalism, which is also based on land, it's agriculture still, and this is important when we talk about a mode of production and what we define as a mode of production. Feudalism is also based on agriculture, and it solves the problem of slavery with respect to having an investment in production, because you have a replacement of the slave with the serf. And the serf has an investment in it because he's tied to the land. But he can't be dismissed from the land, and he can't leave the land. It's a link that can't be broken. But it gives that serf the reason to be thinking about how to improve production, because he may have to give 30% of his product to the landlord, which is now not a slave owner, but a landlord, and it's not a slave, it's a serf. He may have to give 30% away, but if he can expand how much he produces, they will actually end up with more. And their standard of living and their capacity to reproduce their own selves and their own class will in fact expand. So you have feudalism. Oh God, time just goes by so fast. And that's because I talk too much, I know, or I talk too long. Coming out of feudalism, you're moving towards capitalism. Now, how does that happen? That happens because in feudalism, as I said, you freed up people's creativity, their mental capacity to consider how to make improvements in production, and they do. That's what they do. And there are a couple of developments in the process of production that really kind of pushed feudalism upwards and into a new stage. And that was always well, the first part of it was within agriculture. You also, by the way, I didn't mention this, when you get surplus, one of the first things that occurs with the development of surplus is to actually release some people from the food quest. So you go from food foraging to food production, and what you do is you say, okay, you can, the priest class, for instance, is released from the food quest, and then they're expected to deliver onto that population certain bits of information to help their lives, so that they should predict the floods, they should predict solar eclipses, they should predict when is auspicious times to do things. That's part of what they're released from the food quest to do that. And sometimes that release is, only partial, but that's what's going on. So once you get that going, you actually have released people from the food quest, and that will be going on all through this. It's not like it's emerges only with capitalism. It emerged even into slavery. You had people, some of the citizens of Rome, for instance, were artisans. And they would be producing things, all the things. There would have been pottery shops, and there may have been, whatever they were producing. Metals at that time, there would have been metal smelting going on, and they would have been producing metals, armor, things, boots, so who knows all the things that they were producing. So that was already going on within these agricultural societies all the way down. You had things being produced, but the number of people who could be released to do that and the technology that was being used for that was pretty minimal. Within feudalism, the amount of people who could be released to do those things increased, and it increased because of changes in agriculture. And those changes, the couple of the significant changes were the heavy wheel plow and the iron plow. And the heavy wheel plow was particularly significant because it allowed you to change from an oxen, and the reason you used oxes to plow was because they walk slowly, and you had to have them walk slowly because the person holding the plow had to push down on the plow and put the plow into the earth. And that's an enormously, it took an enormous amount of energy to do that and had to be slow. If you didn't do that, the plow would just kind of bounce along the surface. When you got the heavy wheel plow, it allowed the plow to get put into the ground without human labor to push it down. Well, that meant you could go from oxen to a horse. That meant you could plow a whole lot more, a whole lot faster. And that meant production went way up. You didn't need one guy doing this for every 5 acres. You could have one guy doing 40 acres or 60 acres or 100 acres, whatever it was. You could now use one person to do what many people used to do. So that change in and of itself meant that the landlords didn't need so many serfs. So at the same time as you had more people than you needed on the land, you had the growing development of production in towns. And that's another thing that happens, by the way, with agriculture. Obviously, when you have agriculture, you have people settling down. And that's before that, we just kept wandering. You start getting horticulture, you get settlements, you get agriculture, you get bigger settlements, you get houses being built, because you don't build houses if you're not going to live in them. There's no sense doing that, right? So you get the beginnings of houses and architecture and bigger buildings, etc. So in those towns, you have that artisan production going on already. And as I like to say, it's really an interesting thing. 280,000 years on the earth, 100 and whatever thousand, 200 and some thousand of it foraging, 13,000 of it under agriculture or horticulture and agriculture. Once you get into feudalism, they say the slave society of Rome went down in 410 AD. That's the date. It's irrelevant whether it's in fact the date or not, but it's a kind of nice demarcation point to measure it from. In feudalism, you actually have factories existing by the time you get to around 800 AD. So in Flanders and stuff, you begin to get woolen factories developing. And I suspect there's lots of others. That's the one that springs to my mind. So you're getting the town. So you're getting the development of technology and production outside of the land. So production is going outside of the land and needing labor at the same time, isn't that fortuitous? At the same time as the land has an excess of serfs. So you have an excess of population and a demand for population somewhere else. And guess what? People are starting to leave the land and going into the towns and taking jobs as workers within those factories. Within those, and then a lot of them weren't factories, they would have been artisanal shops, you know, they might have been goldsmiths or silversmiths, metalsmiths of one different kinds. I mean, all sorts of things that were happening at that time. And that went on, and nobody minded. As I, you know, the thing that kind of broke that process in just temporarily actually was the Black Plague. When the Black Plague hit Europe, and they say anywhere from, I don't know, 25, 40% of the population of Europe, boom, it's gone. And that then the landlords wanted the serfs back. And there's where you begin to get a conflict between the needs of the class that controlled feudalism, the landlords. They have a certain set of needs. They want the serfs back because their serf population has declined and they're not getting the standard of living they used to. And the people who are employing them in the cities, the new coming up class, you can see it happening. It's growing. It's happening. They have a different interest. They want those people, what they call free. And they don't mean free. They mean available. That's the term. Free means available to me. You're not tied to your land anymore. I don't want that. And so you actually had a conflict. And, you know, we'd all talk about the warlike times of European history where they actually made walled cities. Well, the interesting thing about those walled cities is they were often constructed by the townspeople to protect the population of the town against the local landed aristocracy who were raiding into it to get their serfs back. And that's where you get this development of a law that they negotiated with the landed aristocracy in some places, that if you could stay away, if you were safe for a certain period of time, then you were deemed to be permanently safe. So quite often a year and a day. But you can see the development is changing. Changes in production, both in the land use, how that's being used, but increasingly where the dynamic component of production is occurring is in those towns. That's where it's really all happening. That's exciting. That's just like so much is going on, growing, developing, changing, new techniques all the time. You know, you get people working in a woolen mill, and you're getting shuttle looms instead of, you know, spinning wheels or whatever they've replaced. Who knows? I'm not into that. I don't know that is what I mean. I don't mean I'm not into it. It means I don't know it. But that's what's going on. New techniques, new developments in technology all the time. And those changes are giving rise to a group of people who are employing labor and who have a different set of needs and requirements. And you think about it, how bad is feudalism for capitalism if you have all the rules of feudalism in place? You want to sell your products from Flanders to England, or from Flanders to, I don't know, Germany, very far away. Well, you might have to go through 4 people's territory, and maybe each one of them wants a piece of the pie. But this is crazy. There's different rules, there's different regulations, you don't know. This doesn't work for you. What you want is a wider area for you to be able to work within and sell within. And that's kind of one of the pushes for instance, the expansion of territory. So you have the beginnings of the nation occurring. France, consolidation. Germany, later. Italy, a lot later. England, a lot earlier than that. And that tells you, in fact, if you check about the development of the nation, you're actually tracking capitalism's development in many respects. And that's what they want. They want new rules. They don't want to be taxed, because one of the interesting things is that the king, who is always looking to expand their control, actually begins to negotiate with the bourgeoisie against the landed aristocracy, because the landed aristocracy, very complacent bunch of guys for the most part, not always, but a lot. And what they don't want to pay taxes. They don't want to fund the king's wars and all that. They're resisting all that. Don't you know that? Because every time you take it from us, it's like, you know what? Now I can't afford another gold cup or something. You know, some ridiculous thing that they want. So they begin to use the bourgeoisie's developing production of wealth as a source of income, and then that helps the coming on bourgeoisie in their struggle with the landed aristocracy, because now the king is quite often on their side. Not permanently, because of course he still wants feudalism, because he's a feudal character. I mean, he owns land, and that's the basis of it. But that's one element of that. So the contradiction that develops in feudalism is that it becomes a fetter. And that's in essence every social system's contradiction, is that we talk about it is the developing forces of production and the relative unchanging relations of production, which then begin to hold back those forces of production that are trying to expand, that are trying to establish the conditions for their own growth and development, and this restraining relations of production that is inhibiting that process. That's the core contradiction, and it shows up in feudalism in that way. The bourgeoisie is saying, if we're going to be, if we're going to grow in the way we could grow, and if we're going to drive it, we need new rules, new laws, new conditions under which we work. Labor's got to be free, right? We've got to have nations instead of these piddly little chunks of land that every 10 miles there's a new ruler. No, that doesn't work for us. We need unity of a productive area. So all sorts of the rules of feudalism act as a fetter on those developing forces of production, because the forces of production have shifted out of land and into capital. Okay, and so you get capitalism. And Miguel has already talked about much of what becomes the contradiction there. It's a developing, again, new development of, it's released after you destroy feudal structures. Capitalism is just, and you know, you think about it, 800, and that's what, from 800 to 1200 is the developing ages of that. You begin to get feudalism being cracked, what? Well, in England, somewhere in the 1700s, in France, 1789 is considered where things are like cracked. You know, the cracks in the structure are really showing. But then in England before that, that's not very long. That's not very long. Like 400 years to really see the development from feudalism to the beginnings of the ends of feudalism, and then you're into capitalism. Once you get that, whoa! I mean, we didn't have anything. I mean, think about all the changes in productive capacity, the way we have produced. You know, one of the things we talk about surplus, how surplus is critical, absolutely critical. You cannot understand the wealth that we exist under. And I want to make a point later on about this, about the existence of surplus and the appropriation of it. But if you think, people made a surplus with a digging stick, a fire-hardened digging stick. You know, they could make enough things grow with a fire-hardened digging stick to feed themselves and more. Think about the surplus that is produced by Canadian farmers using a tractor. I mean, Canadian farmers, there's probably 2% of the Canadian population live on farms today. 2%. Now, that's not all farmers, because some of them, they got kids and wives and grannies and aunts or whatever living on those two. So 2% live on farms, and some of them are probably gentlemen farmers who don't even farm. How many people are engaged in farming in Canada? That's not very many people. And those people have produced so much surplus that they can feed every Canadian enough wheat, enough milk, enough meat, enough chickens, enough soybeans, enough, I mean, it's just, and ship it overseas. So we're talking 2% of the Canadian population can essentially feed Canada. That's surplus. That's surplus. That's astounding amount of surplus. And then you put it into how many cars can Canada make? Well, we don't make very many now, but when we did make cars, people made more cars in a day than they could ever drive, than I could ever. I mean, you think about it, enormous productive capacity was released when we got rid of feudalism and moved into capitalism, and it has been growing. But the contradictions within capitalism begin to exert itself again, and you get the developing forces of production continuing to push up, and the relations of production beginning to fetter them. And we're seeing that now, where now you have people trying to halt the use of new developments. In fact, that's what we call a patent. Don't want anybody else to know this. Don't want anybody else to use this. Hold it down. It's mine. And that means that it isn't available to the society. There's another contradiction, a more fundamental contradiction in one sense than that. And then, as Miguel said, the next stage of society, which resolves the contradictions in our society, in capitalist society, is socialism. So, as I said, historical materialism is taking dialectics and materialism, applying it to history, where we notice that quantitative changes in production produce qualitative changes, leading to an alteration of what we refer to as the mode of production. And those are, pre-class societies, foraging, horticulture, pastoralism, and then slavery as a land-based, agricultural-based society, feudalism as an agricultural-based society, capitalism as a society based on the ownership of capital, and Miguel did a good job of distinguishing between capital and money, and then socialism. Now, I just want to say something about that. This is not a complete list of modes of production, and partly there's a lot of reasons. It's Eurocentric, clearly. It reflects what happened in Europe. It's the one we know. We tend to use it because it's the one we know. It does not reflect what happened in Asia, Africa, Middle East. And if you take a look at some of those societies, they share many of the conditions and developments that we see within Europe. There's many replications going on. But there were variations, and they have specific characteristics. The development of the land-based agricultural system in China is somewhat different than the whole development of a state structure, whereas Europe didn't have that, and China had it very early, a huge state structure, quite different in its development. And the other thing we don't know about it, why or how it would develop, is because the West went into those social systems and distorted them, reshaped them in its own image. We don't know quite how some of those social systems would have played out if they had played out on their own. So India, what would have happened? India had an enormous, when Britain arrived in India and China, there is said historically, at least the economists I've read, said that India and China had 25% of the world's production was in those two countries. World's gross national product, 25% of it was in two countries, Europe and a little bit of America that was there at that point, something like 2 or 3% of the entire productivity of the world. They only had a little bit. But they did have one thing that altered it, and they had gunpowder. And that allowed them then to become a dominant force. But we don't know what would have happened in India. We had an agricultural-based social system. We know that. We had classes. We had within classes some rankings of classes as well. Just ranks as well as classes. How that would have emerged or developed into another stage based on capital, because they had enormous, they were way ahead of Europe in terms of, for instance, the production of steel, the production of fabric, all sorts of things that were going on in those societies, and that got distorted and essentially robbed. That's England became a capitalist power so much of it was based not only just on the wealth that they took out of those countries. I mean, the amount that came out of India, I mean, Canada, it's assumed produced something like $50 million that went from Canada to England as a result of colonial conquest of Canada. $50 million, the fur trade, the lumber, all of that, they just took it out. And then of course, they also, since they also got the land, there was a whole bunch of stuff related to just settlement of the land, etc. But $50 million in Canada had nothing compared to India in terms of the productivity. India was, like, as I said, silk manufacturing going on, cotton manufacturing going on, steel manufacturing going on, way ahead of England at the time. And they took hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars out of India. And that money funded the industrial revolution, but also the industries. They destroyed the industries in India. They took the industries away, and then they took the food away, blah, 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 and away it goes. Anyway, that all I'm saying, I got sidetracked there. What I'm saying is that what I'm explaining here is the European model, and we don't know what it would have been if colonialism had not intervened in those other countries. And we don't know how those other developments took place. At least I don't, and I'm sure there are people who do. So these are what we call modes of production. And I'm going to give you some terms that Miguel gave you, and the definitions are not always precisely aligned, but they're essentially the same thing. But I'm going to do it because, and it's on my notes, so it's useful as well when you get the note. We're talking a mode of production, and there's various components. And when you read Marxist literature, on particular around economics, you're going to use these terms. And you see these terms, you need to know it. So the first one is called instruments of production. Instruments of production. So first of all, and I'm going to give these a letter because I'm going to use these to do a formula at the end. The instruments of production, and I'll use the letter A for that, is the tools and machines used in the process of production. Whatever form of production you have, there are a certain set of tools and machines that are used, and those are the instruments of production. The means of production. So you have the instruments, and now you have the means. And the means of production are the instruments of production plus the land, the buildings, the raw materials, and by the way, Marxists consider within the means of production the forms of transport, because you can't kind of produce under capitalism without kind of transporting. Well, you can't produce under any place under, suppose, the level of production would have what was used to transport it in. The forces of production. Oh, so this is B, and the forces of production are C, and this is on your paper, don't worry about it, you'll get it. The forces of production are the instruments of production, plus those who work in the process of production with their skills, knowledge, abilities, and experience, okay? So forces of production are the instruments of production plus the labor. And as I said, that's important because the people who work with instruments are the ones who modify instruments, the ones who develop instruments. I mean, there's a reason why they have suggestion boxes in factories all the time, because the people who work there actually always come up with really good ideas about how to do it better. So that's C, forces of production. Relations of production. Relations of production refer to two, well, actually maybe three, but specifically two kinds of relations. One, the person's relationship to the means of production, because that's specific and it's concrete. What is your relationship to the means of production? And once you decide that, once you know that, you also know something about their relationship to each other in the process of productions. So it refers to the relations that people have to the means and to each other as a result of their relationship to the means to each other. So, and it's not just worker to worker because they have a solidarity, but what about worker to boss? What about serf to landlord? There's a certain character of a relationship base. That relationship to the landlord is not dependent on any variable about those two people. This one could be, you know, the serf could be bright as a genius, and the landlord could be dumb as a potent, excuse me. No, he could be, you know, really little less than capable. And the relationship is still going to be landlord, serf. It's determined by their relationship to the means of I own, you work. That's a relationship. And I'm the boss and you're the worker, or you're the serf. That relation. And it also, as I said, describes your relationship with each other. Why do workers have solidarity with each other? That's a relationship coming out of their similarity of relationship to the means of production. So when we talk about a mode of production, we're talking, okay, so relations of production are D. A mode of production refers to a specific combination of the means of production and the relations of production. So B and D, and it has to be both. So for instance, slavery has the same means of production, land, but the relations of production are different. Slave to slave owner, serf to landlord. That's a different relations of production, same means of production, different mode of production. So a mode of production requires those two issues to be considered. And the next kind of combination here is the relationship between C and D, between the forces of production and the relations of production. And that, as I said, is the constant contradiction in all social systems between the developing forces of production and the relatively stable and unchanging relations of production. Even in early horticulture, that's what you're looking at. Horticulture breaks down because the developing forces of production, tools and techniques, and increased surplus coming out of horticulture and agriculture privatizes. The old thing, the old common ownership becomes a fetter on the further development of productive capacity. And you'd think it wouldn't, but it does, because if you're going to develop it, you're going to develop it privately, because that's the way you're working. So the developing forces of production under early horticulture and early agriculture push you towards private property, and that's the communal property was a fetter, and that's what gave, and that's the point. You don't hold back the forces of production fundamentally. You can retreat, potentially. I mean, to some extent, you can have a time when your social system is smashed and things go backwards, but fundamentally, the dynamic quality is the forces of production, and it will push through. It will push through the relations of production. And that's what we're coming to. And, well, no, let's leave it at that. So we've talked about relations of production. And so I'm going to give you a definition of class. Class. Again, it's on your sheet, so don't worry about it. A group of people sharing a similar relationship to the means of production. Not identical, a similar relationship to the means of production. So you take the means of production in feudalism, land, and you say, what are the relations that people have to that means of production? Own, landlord, work, serf. Separate it out, okay? New group, artisan, peddler, balladeer, maybe, you know, the ones who go around singing and playing at the fairs, whatever. You begin to get those people released from the food quest and becoming separated out. But within the feudal system, you're either owning land or you're working land, or you're some combination of that, because sometimes you own the land, but you owned it in relationship to a bigger landlord. But as a landlord, you have serfs. If you don't have serfs, you're not a well, you may be a landlord, but you're not earning any money off, but you're just sitting on it, right? So the specificity of your position in a social system depends on that. And the same thing goes for capitalism. Now, what is your relationship to the means of production? Okay, so you have now capital. What is your relationship to the means of production? And what are the possible relationships to the means of production? Oh my God, it's getting late. You can own it and not work. You can own it and work. You cannot own it and work, or you cannot own and not work. And I don't think there's anything else you can do, can you? And what? You can have variations within that. And that's true. You always will have variations. I'm going to give you some characteristics of all classes in a second. But a class is a group of people sharing a similar relationship to the means of production, a similar relationship. Now, these people own and work, for instance, what we refer to as petty bourgeois. What do they own and work? They own and work different things. I own a shop, for instance, or I own a doctor's office, or I own I don't know, I'm an artisan making glass in my own little glass studio, or I'm a fisherman on my own, or I'm a farmer. All of those people own their own means of production and own so little of it that they must work it in order to sustain their standard of living. These people own so much of it that whether or not they work is irrelevant. And sometimes you don't even want them to go to work because they mess things up. Like the Eaton brothers were always considered to be a total disaster. If they walked into the store, everybody got scared because they were, and they did, of course, you know, Eaton's went down the tube. May have gone down the tubes for other reasons, but they certainly didn't help. They owned, and you don't want them to come to work. The working class does not own and has to work. Now, yeah, you own 20 shares, guess what? Your standard of living depends on your access to labor, a job. Whether, no matter how good or bad it is, that's what you're living on, fundamentally. So when you want to take a look at class, what you want to do is not look at what they do, is what they what's absolutely have to do. You take away ownership from the petty bourgeoisie, for the most part, their standard of living goes down. Unless they're a professional, in which case they become a hired lawyer for the government and maybe it goes up. But for the most part, they do that. If you take work away from these people, their standard of living doesn't go down at all. So if they show up to work because they like it, you know, like it's like they just get off on it and they like going in being the boss, whatever. But, you know, that's really a problem because if once you get into big capitalism, they can't show up at work. Where the hell is it? They own Loblaw. Which Loblaw do they go to work in? Right? They don't know anything about the actual selling of food. They know how to decide that one doesn't make enough money, close it. Let's open one up over there because there's a new population developing. They make economics decisions. They don't make any production decisions anymore. So they don't show up to work in the workplace if they show up at all. And even then, they don't do it. So what are the key features of class? And I'm going to stop. I'm sorry. I know we've really kind of beaten you to death here today, but that's the nature, right? That's just what happens. I'm just going to give you 5 features of class and then I'm going to stop. Even though I could keep on going, I've got so many other things to tell you, but we'll stop at that. 5 features of classes. Classes are relational. And again, it's on your sheet of paper. It's coming to you. Don't panic. What does that mean? It means fundamentally, you can't have one class until you get to socialism. In which case you can have a working class, but then it won't be the working class. It will be both the working class and the owning class and everything. But you can't be a slave unless there's a slave owner, and you can't be a slave owner unless you have a slave. Boom, just like that. That's, you know, you've got to have more than one in order. You can't be a boss if you don't have a worker. End of that. So you have to have 2 at least for there to be classes. Classes are not static. They come into being and they go out of being. Up until the bombing of Libya, we didn't apparently have a lot of slavery. Apparently it's now on the rise. But that category of people, for instance, in the United States, hopefully, although you never know for sure in that country, shouldn't exist. It's gone out of being. So they come in, they grow and they change over time. They come into existence and they go out of existence. They're not monolithic. No class is monolithic. It has internal divisions and segments that are sometimes problems for them and cause conflicts between them within that particular class, but they're not monolithic. Within the working class, you have white collar, you have blue collar, you have the private sector, you have public sector, you have skilled, you have manual labor, you have women, you have men, you have racialized sectors who have different relations within. So they're not monolithic within the particular class. And within the petty bourgeoisie, you have, artisans, shopkeepers, all of those. Within capital, you have finance capital, industrial capital, speculative capital, all that sort of differentiations within it. So classes are not monolithic. Within class structured societies, there has to be conflict. And it's based on objective reality. It's not based on whether the persons that have the conflict like each other, don't like each other, are nice, are not nice. The conflict is structural. Means that your position and what is good for your position is structurally opposed to somebody else's. So a slave's the slave owner's structural interest is to keep the person a slave. That's just, doesn't matter. That slave owner may beat you, maybe he doesn't beat you. That's not the issue. Not the issue at all. And the same thing with capital. What's good for the workers is in the long term, over time, not good for the bourgeoisie. And the last feature of class, and then I'm going to just, as I say, I promise I'm going to stop. For a class structured society to exist, there must be an element, there has to be an element of what we refer to as false consciousness. And false consciousness is the lack of understanding on the part of a particular class as to the fact that they are part of that class quite often. And even if they know that, to know what is in the interest of that class. And it's not merely that what is in the interest is to get a better wage, because that's just not a class. That's an individual worker's interest is to get a better wage. What is in the interest of the class? What's in the interest of the class is to destroy the system that keeps them as workers. That's the class interest. And workers within capitalism have to not know that. If they did, we'd be in a different stage. The obverse is also true. And in order for a class society to exist, the ruling class of that society, and the ruling class in every social system is always the one who owns the means of production. Has to be the landlord, the slave owner, the capitalist. They have to have the obverse of false consciousness, class consciousness. And that is to know that they are a class as a whole and what is in the interest. And when you saw the break between feudalism and capitalism and all those philosophers who started talking about freedom and individualism, those people were articulating the class interests of the upcoming class in opposition to the feudal class. That's what was going on. And they hold that class consciousness and they understand whatever the difference is between, I'm owning a steel mill and you're owning a woolen mill, and this one's over here doing something else. That difference isn't important. What's important is ownership of private property and the sanctity thereof and the legitimacy of there, and that all the rules should facilitate that ownership and maintain that ownership. That's their class interest, and they have it. And then when they stop having it, they're in trouble. That's when they're in trouble. As I said about the Romans, when they began to fall apart was when they lost a common collective understanding of how to maintain their power. Give this to them. No, that doesn't work. Give that to them. No. When they start dithering about how to maintain their power, they're in trouble. And sometimes we see a little bit of that. We're seeing a little bit of that. And that's what gives us hope. Okay. And I'm going to quit there, and you will get the notes. And I hope that you've learned something today. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. We have a number of questions, so I'll go through a couple of them if you want. So this is going back to the beginning of it. Many comrades have been critical of my continued faith in spirituality as a Marxist. I recognize it is not materialist. Could you speak more on the interplay of that idea of the supernatural and materialism?
Okay, first of all, personally, I find the concept of a spiritual quality being limited to the understanding of a supernatural as a false dichotomy. I mean, maybe spiritual is the wrong term, but humans have more than their, we appreciate art. And you take a look at really early human beings are out there decorating things. They're decorating. Now, what's that? That's really an interesting aspect of humans, manipulation of the physical universe, that they actually perceive decoration as some form of improvement of their lives. And the notion that somehow materialists can't appreciate beauty, nature, literature, art, music, all of that, that's a characteristic, I think. I use the term spiritual to cover that, and maybe it's the wrong term, but so that's one aspect of it. So part of it is to not make this dichotomy between a materialist understanding of the world and saying that production is important, and then saying, but there's a component of our lives that derives benefit from apparently non-productive processes. Well, they are productive in the sense that they give us joy and beauty. So art and literature, etc. But with respect to the supernatural, which you raised specifically, and that's a really, I suppose is a touchy question, obviously, because there are a lot of believers in supernatural who also ascribe to a desire to change capitalism, or what, as it turns out, capitalism. So we'll use it within that context. And I don't want to put them down. They have a sincere objection to the ugliness and the horror which exists of capitalism, and more power to them. But it, as you said, it is a bit of a contradiction. If we understand the world to be a material thing, the idea that there is a supernatural being who manipulates that material thing is in fact contradictory. It is, to be honest. I'm not shitting on people's belief in that. And as I said, I appreciate that they come to us with the idea that on a basis of a religious understanding of what is good and bad, they have rejected capitalism, and that's correct. Their rejection is correct. The basis of their rejection, and by the way, we are all motivated, really. I always say that if we're not motivated by an objection to the ugliness of capitalism, that's the thing that drives us forward, but it shouldn't be the thing that controls it, right? It's not the steering wheel. It may be the engine, but it's not the steering wheel. The steering wheel's got to be an understanding of material reality, because that's going to decide how to organize, what to argue for, what do we want, how are we going to get it. All those decisions are going to come out of an understanding of material reality. But the driving force for that is, in some people's case, a religious opposition to the ugliness of capitalism. From other people, it's just, humanity. It's like we're driven by an objection to inequality and meanness and poverty and sexism and racism and war. A friend of mine used to teach, and he always used to say, Capitalism is wonderful except for 4 things: racism, sexism, poverty, and war. And really, there it is. And if you object to it, and your objection is based on a belief that God says it's wrong, welcome to the struggle. It's not why I do it. I don't believe in God, but I'm opposed to the same thing as you are. So I'm not going to get into that, but you understand.
Okay, thank you. So here's another question. Is there any difference between the ancient form of slavery and the slavery practice in the US before the Civil War?
Yes.
Or is it basically the same, just the latter being capitalism?
But what's interesting about slavery, and this is really an interesting question, because really slavery doesn't fit in capitalism, does it? I mean, really, when you think about it, it's free labor that capitalism needs. So why did we get slavery? And there's a couple of differences between slavery in the ancient world and slavery in the modern world. And one of the differences is that it wasn't based on race. In the ancient world, it was based on who you happened to conquer. It didn't matter. No, they didn't care what they looked like or what language they spoke or anything else about them. It was conquest that did it. And quite often, what you wanted for a slave was not somebody you deemed inferior, but somebody you deemed superior. So for instance, in Rome, a favorite slave would have been from Greece, because the Greeks had, the learning. And so you would go and get a slave who knew mathematics. They teach your kids and language skills and blah, blah, blah. So that was the slave, was one who had more skills than you, not one who wasn't skilled. So one of the things is it wasn't based on race. And the other thing that was quite often the case with early slave societies was there was an end to slavery. Now, almost every slave society in the ancient world had the built-in notion of that at some point the slave would become free. What's different in modern, what happened and why we got slavery in capitalist times was the advent of plantation agriculture fundamentally. It's plantation agriculture which gives rise to slave society, modern slavery. Because in agriculture, if you have agriculture development, you have serfs and blah, blah, blah. But when you came to America, when you came to the New World, 2 things happened. One, the population was relatively small. And the second thing about that population is they weren't particularly keen on working for you. And they had the ability to kind of move around without your ability to get them. So they were made slaves. Indigenous population were made slaves, but it was really problematic kind of tenuous existence. But you needed more than that. You needed large scale. You're going to do cotton and sugar and all of those things, massive, massive numbers. And what you did was you went and you stole people from another world. And in order to do that, in a sense, is the modern slavery came, and we know racism really emerged as a ideological construct with development of slavery in the modern world. So, and the struggle within the United States around the Civil War was really a struggle between slave society and capitalism. That was really what was going on in that world, because one of the things about modern slavery was that one of the products that you produced in slave societies was slaves. You actually begin to have a market in slaves, as you know that. You have the slave market, here's this one for sale, here's that one for sale, here's that one for sale, and then descriptions of how they are, blah, blah, blah. You're selling slaves. So what happened in the United States, why you had a civil war, was the slave states wanted to export slaves to the frontier lands, the opening lands of the West. Capitalism knew if that happened, they weren't going to have a market for products. The slaves don't buy diddly squat. They get whatever the Lord gives them. Blah, blah, blah. And that capital, that fight between, is the new section of America going to be capitalist or slave, was the basis of the Civil War fundamentally. They were fighting it out, and capitalism won, obviously. And it was an advance. I don't want to put that one down. That's a real advance. But that was the difference between slavery, and quite often the slaves in the ancient world were personal. Well, they were in the New World too, but you had a lot of personal slavery, but they were productive as well. But as I said, they weren't based on race, and it wasn't a permanent condition necessarily. You could have the chance to get out of it, and it was, I said, wasn't based on plantation agriculture.
All right, thank you. Another question. Is financial capitalism a distinct mode of production, or does it have the same fundamental characteristics as industrial capitalism?
Well, it takes place when it's its form of capitalism, right? Now, it appears not to be linked to production, but you can't have money being moved around unless there's production down below. I mean, this notion that somehow or other, I mean, you know, you think about England, for instance, being a financial capital headquarters, or I don't know, even Singapore and places like that, which become hubs of financial capital. And they are, I mean, that's true, there's a real thing there. But if you stop all the production, I mean, no more t-shirts, no more cars, no more computers, no more food, no. You've got to have production on the ground, and it's taking place within an existing capitalist structure, and it's finding niches within that. I mean, you're always thunderstruck by the capacity to discover, you know, those mortgages. I mean, who knew that you could make tons of money out of mortgages that weren't going to get paid? I mean, who would have thought that? That's an astounding thing, but it's only within the basis of capitalism. You're not separating it out. It's within a structure based on the exploitation of labor power, and this is merely a deviant way. I mean, it's not particularly deviant anymore, but a way of extracting some of the surplus that the workers have, taking it back away from them. So I won't get into all the features of it, but it's not a separate mode of production, I don't think.
Okay, thank you. Another question. Is some understanding of class struggle within lower stage socialism recognized? What character does it take, and how can it be navigated without falling for conflict that can be utilized by reactionary, counter-revolutionary, or imperialist elements?
Oh, Lord. Oh, well, if I knew that. I mean, well, I don't even want to go there. You know what? Let's discuss that in the well, if I may not be around that long, but you know, you've got lots of years in the Communist Party. That's a discussion that you're going to have and keep on having and examining and readjusting your thinking about, because I don't know the answer to that. Clearly, the divisions within the classes don't disappear when you get to socialism. All those divisions continue to exist. The process of getting there hopefully will break some of those down. We will achieve greater amounts of unity across those boundaries. We will begin to recognize what are our common links. So we don't assume that it will be exactly the same way. But if we assume that somehow they will disappear instantaneously, I mean, look at every socialist society. They still struggle with some of those things. And they struggled for 70 years in the Soviet Union. They're struggling, I'm sure, in Cuba with it. And the better they do it, the more unified, the more dynamic, and the more successful they're going to be. Because part of the issues that will undermine a social system will be the level of inner class struggle that continues on. And it's inner class. It's not separate classes to some extent, although there may be remnants of separate classes. And no one's to say that a particular path to socialism is to just bang, you know, every private owner is just gone. You can't do that. We don't know how it's going to be, but most of the struggle will be between members of the same class, but different segments of that class, and their capacity to unite against the attempts by people to restore capitalism will depend on their ability to overcome those divisions.
All right. Okay. There's a question just about what about Spanish slavery in Chile, where it was primarily about mining? Could it be said slavery in some cases was to resolve an issue of labor shortage in the
Yes.
early colonial stage?
That's exactly as I said. That was the point about the plantation agriculture was precisely that. There was a shortage of labor. And you're right about the silver mines in Chile and stuff. I mean, Marx talks about how ugly and brutal and nasty, you know, capitalism was in its colonial conquest. And one of the ones he uses as an example is, in fact, the silver mines. And it's correct. What it is was, and particularly not only because the population was dispersed within the Americas, which smaller and dispersed, but also, as I said, because they, to be in this, to the mines, by the way, essentially what they did was they locked them in. They just put them down the mines and that's it. You're down there. Boom. End of story. You know, you'll come out when you're coming out in a box. And they died down there. So, you know, it was slavery and it was an attempt to solve the problem of they weren't doing. And by the way, of course, if you use slave, you've got an enormous amount of surplus. And if you're not selling, if you're taking it all home to the home country, you don't need a market. So paying wages is kind of not a concern at that point. So yeah, slavery is the Spanish slavery, you're right.
Okay, another question. How does the gig economy and growth of freelance and contract work complicate how we understand class, where one might own some of the means of production, i.e. tools, software, and may subcontract some work to others, but aren't capitalists or bosses in a traditional sense?
Right. And fundamentally, it's all of that economy was a way of capitalism to undermine, well, to lower its own cost, because, you know, they could often make it cheaper by putting it out. And to some extent, it undermines the capacity of the working class to organize against it. I mean, somebody just said the other day that one of the decision that occurred within California to make Uber a contract, you remember that was that on the referendum in the election, was the question of whether Uber drivers were workers or contract self-employed contractors. And California voted, unfortunately, to consider them self-employed contractors. And that is going to be, and this person was arguing, this is opening a Pandora's box. I mean, every employer is now going to say, how can I do this? Well, I'm going to send my secretary home and she can type on their computer at home and just send it via computer to me, and she'll be a self-employed contractor. Well, clearly it's a process that the working class should be resisting in its entirety. To the extent that it can, it should be resisting this. This is totally destructive of the capacity of the working class to fight for its own interests. It really is. I mean, and that's why it's there. I mean, its introduction is because it lowers the cost of labor power. It weakens labor power. And, you know, I mean, you talk about owning your own means of production. What the hell is a bicycle if you're driving a, you know, a DoorDash guy driving a bicycle? What's a bicycle? That's not a means of production. The means of production is what you're driving, what you're delivering. It's not the thing that you're driving it on, or an Uber driver. I mean, this is, and of course it goes beyond just the production. It's called, you're running a business that doesn't pay business tax. Who's paying the business tax for these guys? So you know these. You have a taxi company, and by the way, those taxi company, the drivers fought for standards, and the system fought for imposing regulations on who could own one, and driving ability and the safety of the cars, etc. And then everyone comes over, boom, it's all gone. No standards for the drivers, no standards for the vehicles. And nobody's paying taxes. I mean, what is it called? Airbnb. They're running a hotel. No hotel. No hotel fees. I mean, you get the Royal York, it's got to pay taxes to the city. You have an Airbnb, what do you got? I mean, a person in my building, fortunately, blocked it, but was starting to do Airbnb. She's not going to be paying taxes to the city for all the income. She probably didn't declare the income, let alone the fact that she's running a business. She's not paying business tax. Anyway, yeah, it's just really destructive. It's really, and it may develop its own contradictions, and we will see how that plays out. But first and foremost, the working class has got to oppose that. It's destructive. It's counterproductive.
Okay, can it not be said that financial capitalism has perverted our relationships at large to the modes of production which serves to sever our immediate exposure to exploitation while maintaining our relative material comforts for a large enough population so as to avoid a revolutionary boiling point?
Does financial capital do that? I'm not sure it does. I mean, if you take a look what financial capital did to the city of Detroit, I don't think it severed. I mean, it really created a boiling point there. I mean, it totally destroyed. And it not just a class of people, it destroyed a city. I mean, it just took it from a city to like a wasteland, right? So I don't think financial capital makes capitalism much more attractive in any way, shape, or form. I think financial capital, to some extent, makes it even uglier, because part of it, what it does is it really extends that inequality. You know, so you end up with the, you know, the Jeff Bezoses and people who are apparently, you know, it's not even apparently, they are just beyond comprehension. It's like, duh, they got so much. I mean, it is beyond comprehension. 3 people in the United States own as much wealth as the bottom 50%. 3. I mean, talk about the concentration and centralization of capital. I mean, that's one of the things. I mean, I didn't even get into that because we're getting late as it is. But the point is about capitalism, you get concentration and centralization of capital. It's going on, finance capital and industrial capital. It's happening. And we're seeing it happen in the pandemic. And we saw it going on before the pandemic. And it was accelerated with the pandemic. And it's getting worse. And that financial capital hasn't been able to make capitalism look good. It may have bought off segments of the working class with benefits. But you know, you think about it, who are some of the best paid workers in capitalism? Sports people. You know, they're making $5 million a year. That looks like capitalism to most people, but it's not. And I got news for you. They're still making a surplus. They wouldn't be paying those people $5 million a year if their labor did not produce a surplus for the owners. It's still capitalism. And even though it's not as significant as it could have been, those people took a stand against racism. $5 million be damned, I'm down on my knee. I'm not standing for the national anthem. So it doesn't get rid of the ugliness of capitalism. It's racism, it's sexism, it's poverty, it's war. It doesn't get over that. And it can make some of us look pretty comfortable relative to the overwhelming poverty that we face in this world, including in Canada. And we're not taking this like there's another world that is poor, and we're not. The other world is poor, but we got chunks of it here, and it's ugly here too. And it doesn't get rid of that.
Okay, thank you. Some other questions here. This is related. I guess somebody's mentioning that it's incredibly hard to unionize musicians because they're essentially all competing with each other, something I've been struggling with. Could you maybe say some comments about how, considering that we're in this situation and people are in precarious situations, how they might be able to organize?
Well, we do know that, for instance, there have been successful union drives around things like, I guess it was, what was it, the DoorDash that, was it DoorDash? Fedora, that Cup W tried to unionize. So of course, the problem is that the company just said, okay, you unionized, we're gone. Like, okay, we're not going to be around here. Yes, precariousness, obviously, it undermines the capacity of the working class to resist. And as I said, they may not be conscious of it, though I'll bet you there's some people within that class who are conscious of it. I suspect, I mean, one of the things that the ruling class does, and we will get to the point where we are the ruling class and we will do the same thing, and that is they employ a raft of people to tell them how to do it. They don't do it themselves. They don't even, I mean, some of them haven't got the capacity. And if they got the capacity, they don't want to spend the time doing it. The point is, there are a gazillion people out there willing to turn their brain to the idea, to the task of how to do this to the working class. Just like they hired people to figure out how to undermine socialist societies. It wasn't a mistake on the part of capitalism, imperialism, to fund the Taliban. That was a conscious effort. They knew what they were doing. They knew that they could take a religious idea, fund it and give it arms and turn it into an enemy of the ruling society. They knew that. And those were called anthropologists and sociologists and blah, blah, blah. And they hire economists and political scientists and sociologists and anthropologists and marketing and all of them. I mean, it's tons of people who are workers themselves, but whose job it is to figure out what are the things that we need to do to keep this class in power. What are all the mechanisms? Every mechanism, and they examine all of the possibilities. I mean, one of the things, for instance, is like getting rid of huge factories. Very useful. Another one, like if you can do that, you get rid of a lot of collectivity, obviously. I mean, if you're going to work with 10,000 people, you got 10,000 brothers and sisters, allies in the struggle, right? If you go to work with 3, you got 3 allies. But another one, just as a classic example, I mean, and you think about it, it comes across as just being a rational way to do things, but it has consequence. We used to have to go and get your unemployment. You had to line up and get the check. And guess what you did? You talked to the other unemployed and you grumbled. This is not right, right? Well, now you get it in the mail. You don't talk to anybody. Guess what? You think you're alone. You think you're a failure because you're there by yourself getting your check. Well, collectivity has been smacked. And some of it occurs as a natural consequence of developments, but some of it, let us be clear, is absolutely that the enormous attention to how to maintain power. And they spend an awful lot. They got think tanks coming out their ears. They got think tanks. And one of the things we should always be aware of is every time you see some organization saying we should not tax the wealthy, know for sure that's a think tank funded by the capitalist class. And always the case. Anyway, was that a bit of a side rant? Maybe. I don't know.
So we don't have any more questions, but I don't know if that's.
And it's 10 after 5.
It's 10 after 5. Everyone's been really good. I'll maybe just put out one final call just in case there's something that people are really wanting to cover. But I'll just mention that we will be meeting again next Sunday, the same time. I'll send out a link for it. We'll have 3 presenters. The first presentation will be on the program of the Communist Party of Canada, which is available on the website. So that's basically our understanding of how we are going to get to the revolution and beyond. The second is gender, race, and class. And the third one will be the national question, which will get into issues of Indigenous sovereignty and the struggles there as well. So ideally, I hope everyone can join us again. If you're not able to, that's okay. You can tell me too, and we will probably be doing another school sooner than later. So you might be able to and on weeknights rather. So you might be able to make those. So I see some questions here. I'm just going to go dig them out. Sorry. Where would I put my questions on OPSEC? It's not a union. I mean, operational security. Are we far enough along for the matter? We'll cover sort of organizational stuff in our final Sunday, which will be March 14th, as we're skipping the March 7th, as that's International Women's Day. And we'll have an online event with some speakers there, which should be pretty good then too. Just seeing. Okay, I think that will be it then.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks.
It was really nice to be here. Good to see all of you. I've been watching some of your faces show up on the screen. So bye to everyone. Stay safe.
And
I enjoyed it, as you can tell.
and I'll keep it running if people want to chat with each other or do something like that too as well. So thank you very much.
How's everyone doing?
Hey, Waikiki.
Hey, how's it going?
Oh, good. How are you? Oh
Good.
my God, what a great school. So much information. Like I didn't even there's so much to absorb, really. It's really yeah, very rich. Jean and Miguel are always amazing though.
Mhm.
Yeah. How are you doing?
Fantastic. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. I guess next Sunday, same time, eh?
Who else was cleaning their computer desk or their room while doing their
Multitasking. I was doing sit-ups. I was strengthening my lower back muscles because I've been sitting at my very unhealthy chair working from home 4 days a week, and it's like I need to bring an office chair in here because this is bad for my back. Holy shit, am I feeling it?
Oh yeah, you gotta upgrade from the couch. I did the couch.
Yeah.
I did the couch for about 2 weeks, and that was about as long as I could last. Today I